something in a book by Lim. It's not really on this, but he makes in there, there's a conversation that makes a connection that I hadn't made before. And I'd just like for you to read it to you.
Yeah, please.
It says, an almighty God must also be all-knowing. Absolute power is not something independent of absolute knowledge, because he who can do all but knows not what the consequences will attend the bringing into play of his omnipotence is ipso facto no longer omnipotent.
Yes.
And I had not made that connection before. And,
yes.
and it seems like there's also a corollary, although it's not part of what Lim was writing about how our finite knowledge as finite beings, of course, limits our will.
That's right.
Since we can't know the future, our will, we can't really even expect our will to act correctly or efficiently or whatever the term would be.
Right.
You know, because we just send willful acts, fling them into the future and kind of see what happens. Oh well, that's enough of that. But
when you speak of knowledge or awareness, there's several different levels of awareness in us. And there's only, I think most of it's below the level of conscious awareness.
Right.
There's aspects of us that know what it's doing without our normal top of the world consciousness being present. Walking, we don't consciously make every single move of our body when we're walking. A lot of it's subconscious.
Yeah.
A lot of the things we do in life from things beneath the normal, our what Rudolf Steiner called it day waking consciousness. We dream and even experience spectacular things in our dreams, or even have spectacular thoughts, but it's at a different level of consciousness. Now, I'm just querying when you say all-knowing, omnipotent knowledge. What sort of knowledge are we talking about?
Oh, Christian God. That's what the discussion was about in Lim. And I had never made that. If our God is going to be omnipotent, he must be omniscient, because without the knowledge, the will can't be omnipotent. And the converse of that is true for us as finite beings. Our knowledge being limited, our will be limited by our lack of knowledge. Anyway, I've just derailed the meeting enough, other than I will comment that with section F, the degree of difficulty went from about a 3 to a 9 here.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm eager to have Rick explain this while I sit quietly.
Oh, you want to dive on to mythos and logos, huh?
Well, this is all, I was kind of thinking maybe it's mythos or logos, or mythos contra logos, or maybe it's a mixture, or maybe he's sort of telling us a myth in this section.
Might I add, when I was trying to say what I did, is I would say, don't think the way our lives pan out is a product of our conscious choices completely. How much of it is conscious choice?
Yeah, a lot less than we think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Phil, you've had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering whether Donald didn't have it wrong in a sense. It almost seems the opposite. Is that when you're a limited being, you don't know what the real reality is. And in order for you to have any semblance of what the reality is, you have to reach into the unknown in order to face the relationship between possibilities and probabilities. So you're forced into that position. So therefore, you must be free, in a sense, to explore the relationship between possibilities, because that's all you have, because you do not know what it is, what might be possible, and what might be probable. And so therefore, it's exactly the opposite. You have to have free will in order to explore that dimension, in order to get moving into the dimension of the unknown, of the, I wouldn't say the infinite, but you begin to approach the divided line, And so therefore, in a sense, free will is absolutely necessary, because without it, you're just left to, well, what will be, will be. I mean, that's all you have. You have no choice. Just to say, let it happen. It is what it is. That's all you have. And they said, well, but you're called upon to do something about your life. So it can't just be, it's going to be what it's going to be. It probably will be what's going to be, but you're trying to fight against that because you want to have some degree of moving in a direction that will be helpful to your existence now. So I'm not so sure whether and that's not pretending that you're going to eventually become God and all-knowing. In fact, in some ways, you could argue God has no free will. He has to do what he does because he knows it's governed by the inevitability of what it is. So he's the one that does not have free will. So you could argue it exactly the opposite way, is what I'm saying.
Very well said, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, that there are interconnections between being omnipotent and omniscient that involve necessity, and that are not, we can't work them out because we're finite. We can fantasize about having one or the other. We can run these thought experiments, but we can do that because we are neither all-powerful nor all-knowing, which means we don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about all-knowing or all-powerful. We're struggling to try to represent something we only have the most tenuous grasp of.
I remember, I think back in somewhere around 2005 or 6, the Mission Impossible. I think that was the one where Tom Cruise was hanging onto the plane or something, and let's say, was it Cisco and Eberg? Cisco had died, and Eberg was hosting the 2 thumbs up broadcast, right? And he had guest speakers come along, and so that sort of like was not as good, but it was okay. And then what happened was one day, Roger Ebert got terribly ill as well, and so there was one guy, Joe Siegel, who was the critic for I think CBS, or was it ABC? One of them. And he came along, and they were happening to be talking about Mission Impossible. And Joe Siegel said something that just astonished me. I thought it was very clever. He says, well, there's a problem with the name. He says, it should be called Mission Impossible. It really should be called Mission Improbable, which is interesting because human beings are not dealing with the possibilities, the impossibilities. We're dealing with the probabilities, and this is actually mission improbable.
Yeah.
I thought that was worth the whole critique. It was like,
A moment of philosophy intrudes upon this film review.
that was interesting. I thought, I think what he was saying in a way, he didn't say it, but it was like, we are living in a world of derivatives. We create the relationship between possibilities and probabilities, not the relationship between probabilities and actualities or realities. Although those two words are kind of confused anyway, because actuality is actually supposedly the realization of reality mapped onto probabilities, which then become actualized. So I'll just leave it there. Mission improbable. That's a life we're living in.
Yes. Thank you, Phil. Well, since you brought up reality and actuality, I'm gonna take a moment here to do a Kenneth Smithism. In Kenneth Smith's writing, he uses these two vocabulary terms in a very precise way. And he uses it from the concept that each of us believes that we're dealing with reality when we're actually projecting out of our character and experience what we think reality is. And so if you've got 7 billion people, you have, at least 7 billion realities, maybe more like 14 billion or 21 billion. We don't always only have one reality that we're wrestling with, but that what we share in common, which Heraclitus calls nature, or the logos, Kenneth Smith calls actuality. He uses the term actuality for the thing that is actually there, and reality for the things that we think are real. And much philosophy is to be had by exploring the discrepancies between the many realities and the one actuality. 8 billion. I can't keep pace. Okay, so we have choices this week. We had a little gap because of my bronchitis, and we are right on the boundary between section E, daimon and eudaimonia, and section F, mythos and logos. Donald put in his vote for mythos and logos. For those who are just joining us, his take is that reading daimon and eudaimonia is about a 3 on the difficulty level. And by the way, this scale is not everyday reading scale. This is Kenneth Smith's reading scale, which goes up to a 10 that's not accessible to people who just read newspapers and magazines. So he rated daimon and eudaimonia a 3 at difficulty, but he rates mythos and logos a 10. Did you say 9? 9 at difficulty? Yeah, something like a 9 at difficulty. And that he would like to proceed and start, dissecting. Is that the case, Donald?
I may have just misremembered where we were, but I thought you had said we were going on.
I did say that.
But yes, I do view this as a very difficult section. He becomes there are more words here, but it is denser. This is a longer section that's even denser.
Yes.
It's like what Kant said about the critique of pure reason, when his editor forced him to cut it down, that this book would have been a lot shorter had it been longer.
Yes.
Because more would have understood it more easily. But yes, all the examples went away.
Yes.
So
so let's dive into F then, because let's do it. Let's do it. For those just joining us, welcome. This is Millennia and Microcosm, week 55. We are working our way through a book by philosopher Kenneth Smith. The book was published as a column, a series of installments in the back of a magazine called the Comics Journal, of all places, around the 1998, 99, 2000 timeframe. And David and I are working on collecting it into a book form, Millennia and Microcosm. It's a book that tries to teach us how to escape the trap of the modern worldview. And what makes it a trap is that for most moderns, it's the only worldview we have. And the idea that you should have multiple worldviews and be able to shift between them is not something we teach in school. We teach the idea that the past is full of people who are primitive and wrong. They're cheap imitations of us. We're the most glorious, objective, scientific, rational people in history. And, you know, the future is Star Trek, which means more of us just continuing the way we are, because what could be better than us? We sort of imagine an end of history in which the history that we project into the future is just sort of a, you know, modified version of the present. So with that in mind, you know, what Kenneth Smith would like us to do is to learn how to shift between worldviews, to look at the world through different lens systems. And he says, by doing this, this is how we begin to create freedom for ourselves, because we begin to make choices about what is the most useful, the most revelatory, you know, a way of looking at a particular situation based on the collection of lens systems we have. So this book's, in order to do this, he works to help us to understand three different epochs and how they saw the world: the ancient epoch, the medieval epoch, and the modern epoch. He saves the modern for last because although it's the most familiar to us, as Hegel said, what's familiar to us is for that very reason not recognized for what it truly is. It's the water we fishy swim in, and so we don't understand the water very well, so we don't know what the alternatives are. So he starts with the ancient, and he covers all the details of the ancient worldview in a single chapter. That's chapter 4, which we're in right now. Yeah, because he's covering, you know, an entire epoch's worldview in a single chapter, what he's doing here is writing very densely. Chapter 4 has to be unpacked more than any of the other chapters. He's trying to say an enormous number of things in a very small amount of space. When he gets to the medieval worldview and the modern worldview, he's gonna relax and take more time, more chapters to explicate, you know, how do the medievals see the world that's different from the ancients, and then how do the moderns see the world that's different from ancients or medievals. So we're working our way through chapter 4. Chapter 4 is made up of 8 lettered sections. We've been through 5 of them, and each one showed us some aspect of the way the ancients see the world that's radically different from the way we see the world. Not worse, not a savage, primitive, you know, superstitious version of ourselves, but actually different. They had a different way of conceiving of humanity, of nature, of the gods. And what I think we've done a pretty good job of showing for these 5 topics that we've gone through so far, that in fact it's the case. These subjects, they saw the world very differently. And that there are times when the modern perspective on those topics have the advantage, and there are times when the ancient perspective has the advantage. It's not like comparing, you know, alchemy to chemistry. It's like comparing chemistry to physics. They see the world in different ways. They're strong at different things. They're weak at different things. The sections we've covered so far, section A is nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. And that's exploring the idea that the ancients saw the world not as a meaningless collection of parts or pieces or gears, a pantry or a toolbox for us to do what we will, but they saw instead that nature established what's true and what's not true. If something doesn't ever occur in nature, then it's some kind of fiction. And if it does occur in nature, then it's some kind of truth, regardless of our logic, regardless of our math, regardless of our ideology, regardless of
sorry.
Go ahead.
Can you shut the fuck up?
Okay, another one goes. Got it. We got bombs today. All right, that's fine. Off they go. So that's section A, right? We went through that conception that nature is fundamentally different to ancients than it is to us as a source of meaning. In section B, we explored custom in nature, which is the problem of given what is our relationship to nature, given the way that human beings think, given what kind of animal we are, you know, how do we organize ourselves compared to other animals that are more bound by their instincts, which would seem to limit their freedom. But on the other hand, those instincts are the products of billions of years of evolution, which means they're more harmonized with their actual circumstances. Homo sapiens has this problem, that we have an enormous bonus of freedom, but it comes at the cost of being free to choose really stupid things. I think we had a little bit of that earlier on this call. Just come to think of it, that people don't make good choices because they're free to choose things that are not good for them, or that are evolutionarily poor choices.
That is not my comment, by the way.
I
in the
understood.
chat. Yeah, I did not write that. Yeah.
Yes. So what does that mean? It means that Homo sapiens, more than any other animal, is incredibly dependent upon culture. We desperately need culture to fill in the blanks in us and make us a complete animal. Other animals don't need that to the extent that we do. They have more instincts helping them to harmonize with nature. We have a smaller collection of instincts, and they allow us the freedom to do idiotic things. So there is a role here where culture is supposed to complete the human animal. The acculturation growing up process is supposed to finish our development. That's why we're born half-baked, but human infants can't even hold their heads up, whereas a horse infant is running around in a few hours. The difference is shocking. It's just shocking. It really shows the extent to which, we can overindulge on cheesecake. We have so many choices available to us. So we explored that in section B, and we looked at how that's different from the modern conception of Homo sapiens. In section C, we talked about form and matter, organicism, and arete. We were talking about this idea that the Greeks saw this talked a lot about life and death. How long do things survive? Are things active or passive? And it explored this way that to the ancients, the usual metaphor for things wasn't a thing, but was an organism. Because what organisms do is they sense their environments and they respond internally to adjust themselves in order to survive. So, a sandcastle can't see the wave coming in, and even if it could, it can't do anything about it, and it just washes away when the wave comes. But a small child at the beach sees the wave coming in and can turn and run away from the wave and not be pulled out, right? If they know what they're doing. Birds can do this. Animals have this ability to adjust, to look at the world and not respond to it passively as something that they have to suffer, but to respond to it actively by imposing upon the matter in which they find themselves a form that they prefer to the form that was about to impose itself on them. The wave comes in and they say, "I think not," says the seagull, and it spreads its wings and it takes off. It has it's imposing form upon things. So this whole topic of what is the relationship between form and matter, between who is the shaper and who is the shaped, who is active and who is passive, was a huge preoccupation among the ancients. They read every situation in these terms, and they even took it to the extent of understanding the paradoxes involved, the extent to which to be an effective shaper you have to be shaped by the material you're trying to shape. A carpenter doesn't do well if he tries to treat the wood the way that he would treat marble, and vice versa. You end up to rise to the pinnacle of a craft, you end up becoming not just a shaper, but becoming, in a sense, matter that's being shaped by the form of the matter that you're trying to impose your form on. You know what I mean? There's a paradox involved here. There's relationships involved. The modern tendency to separate things into nice, true and false, good or evil, rich or poor categories wants to split form and matter, for example, into two different things, because we have the medieval conception of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God who made the universe out of nothing and was not constrained in any way and could do whatever he wants, a perfect will. And then we have so we have perfect form as a concept that moderns believe in, and we have perfect matter, where the matter is absolutely passive. It has no meaning of its own, no rights. It just conforms to our will. And we organize our societies this way, in a way that to the ancients would have been bizarre to contemplate. It didn't fit the ancient worldview. We then in section D explored arete, or natural excellence, and this is the idea that species need diversity within themselves. They need as many different skills and insights as they can have, because if you form a culture out of people who can see things in different ways and have different skills, then those skills and perspectives are available to the culture. They become shared. The culture as a whole has more capabilities. If we just stamp out little clone human beings who are all exactly identical, then we have a tiny set of capabilities and perspectives, and we're more likely to fail. And so to the ancients, one of the primary responsibilities of a culture was to create conditions that would allow people to discover their natural excellence, whatever it might be, that you could do better than anybody else, that you could contribute, and then to give you the opportunities to cultivate that, because those became your gifts back to the culture. No child left behind, everybody passes a standardized test, all this stuff that we do in modernity, this didn't make any sense to an ancient perspective. This would be setting ourselves up, from an ancient perspective, that would be setting the culture up for catastrophe and failure. So, we talk a lot about honoring diversity and saying that, we believe, that all people have rights and blah, blah, blah. But when you actually look at how we educate and how we build the law system and everything else, it's all based on interchangeable units, which is quite the opposite of what we claim it to be. The section so those 4 sections came first. The section we just finished was daimon and eudaimonia. And this is exploring human character. And what is the relationship between free will and determinism in people? How much choice do we actually have? It also explores the relationship between to what extent are you an individual and to what extent are you just a symptom of your character or your culture? Where do we stand within that? And of course, we explored here too how the modern perspective is that, well, one or the other must be true. Either you must have free will, or you must have, or your every choice must be determined. And if you read the available modern literature, people generally come down on one side or the other. If they don't, they'll opt for some simple compromise. It must be some of each, and that's it. And the end. It's very childlike perspectives on free will and determinism are the dominant ones in the modern world. But to the ancients, they had a far more sophisticated idea that your character rules over you, rules over your will, rules over your choices, with as much authority as a god rules over their domain. As Poseidon rules over the ocean, so your individual character rules over your choices. And it does that primarily through what you don't see versus what you do see, what you don't want versus what you do want, what you don't find persuasive versus what you do find persuasive. It rules over the near infinity of things that your mind pushes out of your awareness in order to focus on the 7 plus or minus 2 things that you're making decisions about at any given moment. And as such, it's a mighty power, right? It's in the scales of infinities, which is why they use the metaphor of a daimon or a personal god to try to help people understand how authoritative your character is over you. Now that sounds like a recipe for determinism, but where the ancients get sophisticated with this is they say, if you can learn that you have this character and that it rules over you this way, then you can learn to cultivate your character and change it, and thereby change the God who rules over you, as it will. Change what you're able to notice, what you're able to think about, what you're able to care about over time. And in such a way, it means that Homo sapiens has this responsibility to try to self-develop, to try to self-cultivate, to broaden the amount of freedom we have in our lives and the amount of choice we have. It's a complex thing, and that they saw this again as one of the primary responsibilities of a culture. This is why people need cultures, is to help them to do this activity. So this is where we are. We just finished section E on our last session, and we're about to go into section F, mythos and logos. I'm going to call on Phil before we do, but first I just want to note that mythos and logos is the title of a collection of essays that we did in this seminar 2 years ago, some time back, exploring the relationship between mythos culture and logos culture and their different strengths and weaknesses. That discussion was a lot less formal. The writing that we looked at in that was a lot less formal than the writing we're about to go into in section F. As Donald points out, section F is longer than the previous 5 sections, and it's chewier, it's denser. He's wrestling with some very difficult, complex subjects, but part of what makes them difficult and complex is just that we're moderns. If we weren't moderns, we might read section F and go, of course, that's obvious. But as moderns, we're struggling every sentence to try not to impose our own worldview upon what Kenneth Smith is trying to describe, which is a different worldview. And that's part of what makes it hard. So we're going to explore this together. We've been doing this for 55 weeks. It was time for a little summary, a backup, and say, where are we in this process? This is where we are. Phil, go ahead. Come off mute. You've got your hand up.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this whole thing, and it just seems to me you talked about the three levels, nature, the divine, and the individual, or the divine, the individual, and nature, or now I guess we're in like individual. How should I put it? The divine and the and nature, which is interesting because I was thinking about this in a slightly different way, and I thought this might be helpful. It's about the relationship between the one and the many. And that relationship is how we situate it in a sense. We have too much emphasis on the one, in this case, the one of the individual, in which we are absolutely free to do what the hell we want. And that's not good, because you could never really form a collective in that. Then the Middle Ages, it seems like there was the one, but the one God. It's an autocracy, and the relationship filters down. And the Greeks seem to have found a kind of a middle ground, a compromise. The reason why I came to this idea was the Greeks seems to place the gods in the middle because there was sort of something that was beyond the gods. Like there was a deeper law, and they were, in a sense, subject to that. And of course, they rule over the humans, but nonetheless, it turns out to me that the gods, because of that, they seem very human. In fact, those statues of them, they look very human. They are not really gods. They are like supermen, superheroes, if you want to call it that way. And there was a lot of bickering, because they were certainly not perfect. I mean, like Zeus would go against, like somebody else, and then, like Athena would go against Poseidon, It's like they have their own little things and powers, and it was kind of a mess because as human beings struggle, so that the gods, and so there's a two-dimensional chess, the human beings are playing the chess, but the gods are on top of them playing the chess. And so that's a very interesting thing. And I was thinking how that was a reflection of Greek culture in a way, because and I'm thinking about the relationship with the individual to the community. We mentioned how there was also a relationship. It's like the individual is never totally an individual. He's always bound to the community. And this is demonstrated in the Greek tragedy. I mean, there was always that mess of people in the chorus hanging over you, telling you like, no, don't do that, or what are you? Yes, go ahead and do that. And so there was always this in between land in which you can't seem to just go it alone. Well, you could, like Oedipus the king, and see what happens, right? So there was always that relationship in some sense, and I think that was the development of, in a sense, why politics was so important to the Greeks, because that was the relationship between the individual and the community. Not the total community of the world, but the community within the city-state, right? In the community. And so you were never separated. So there was always an equivocation in that loosely fit thing, because you can never just abandon the community. And I begin to wonder, like, we asked this question, like, why did Greece never totally united? Why did it remain these city-states? They were just as hostile against each other as they were against the Persians. Only when the Persians attacked did they kind of unify, and then they went back to fighting each other. And I'm thinking, like, maybe the relationship between one and many could only be sustained, at least at that time, between not so many. In other words, if you were the one, and you understand your relationship to the many, because the many, there's enough diversity to, in a sense, oh, maybe I should think about it. These other guys, they seem to be saying something that I didn't understand. And so there's a kind of a funny relationship about coming to a consensus that seems to, like, you understand. That's greater than the individual. But if there was 8 billion, suddenly you as an individual suddenly disappear, right? And so the balance between the one and the many doesn't really work. And maybe that's why they really restricted themselves to the numbers that they could handle in relationship to the one to the many. Maybe that was the reason. And that's why I took Alexander, in a sense, to convince them, no, there's something more. And then they move in the next stage. But on the other hand, it becomes, in a way, even though as independence it was, Alexander, when he conquered the other nations, he was pretty much like governing like a god in a way, and let the community do whatever they want. So retain the relationship between the one and the many in a funny way, in a loosely knit, you would say, confederation that's dominated by the one. So I think, and of course Hegel picks that up and it says that that's the relationship of Geist and Zeitgeist, right? The one must count, but the one cannot count to the point that it becomes overwhelm the many, because the many also counts. So we constantly have to live in the relationship between the one and the many. The question is, how many can you handle before you disappear? I mean, you really do. And most people feel like, why even bother voting? It's not going to count, right? I mean, in that sense, I think that's one of the burdens of becoming human, is that how does the one relate to the many, and how many? And what is the possibility we could handle? How big can the orchestra be before you actually lose all contact with things? So that was my thought. And the gods were, in a sense, in the same position, that reflected the way the one and the many could be unified or not unified.
Mhm.
Okay. So that's all I need to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I mean, that's right on point, right? It's one of the massive struggles of Homo sapiens, is between the one and the many. We have the potential to individuate so much more because of the structure of our character. And that can result either in the development of someone who can more effectively help a culture be coherent, or the development of somebody who can make it be less coherent, uses powers for, disruption and chaos. Either one is possible. And, the things that the instinctual cultures that animals have evolved to handle, the numbers that are the right numbers for a community of a given species of animal, are sort of determined by the species. Some species are more or less loners. For example, caracals in Africa are mostly just a mother and the cubs, and that's pretty much it. and they get together, to mate or briefly interact, but they separate pretty rapidly. But by contrast, African wildcats make colonies, and lions make prides, and it's totally, even though they're so close, they're cat species are very similar to each other, despite their outward differences. Culturally, they're very similar, but still, you get this kind of what is the right number, if that they can handle, that they can handle without falling apart, is sort of set by the species. But with Homo sapiens, this all important question of the one and the many is as variable as every other all important question when it comes to Homo sapiens. You've got some cultures where people can barely stand each other, and other cultures where people cling together in enormous numbers. The classic example is the Navajo and the Hopi, and they both comment on this a lot because they live near each other. The Hopi reservation is largely inside the Navajo reservation, and it's been that way since before Europeans got here, when it was just, it wasn't a reservation, it was their land. And they have noted how the Hopi like to gather together into pueblos like bees and beehives. They're incredibly concentrated in how they gather, and their entire culture, their religion, their language, everything about them is oriented towards that kind of a dense configuration. But meanwhile, their next door neighbors, the Navajo, who are around them on every side, are exactly the opposite. They split out, and they build their hogans far away from, and they prefer to build their hogan where they can't see any other hogan, where they have some gorgeous view of a mesa, or a river valley or the sunrise, and where you can't see any other hogans, they separate. And if you study the two cultures in detail, you see they have a remarkable amount in common. You'd think, how can they be so different on the one versus many question? Then why would they do that? Well, the answer is culture is just all important for Homo sapiens. It's the great determining factor that figures out if we're gonna what kind of numbers are the right number of us to be together sustainably. And when we look back over the few thousand of years of human history that we have any documentation for, the conclusion that we reach is that nobody's got the answer to this question. Every culture, part of trying to understand that culture has to be studying how it came down on this question of the one versus the many, and why and how. So I'm glad you brought it up. It's critically important. It's one of the themes running through all this. So why don't we turn to the text, if you guys are willing, and we can kick off with the first sentence. Moderns have identified with the Greeks precisely as prefigurations of the kind of rationalizing revolution that Hegel, Marx, Weber, and others have seen carried out by modern science, modern law, modern bureaucracy, and modern capitalism. That is to say, the extent to which we see the Greeks and think, well, they're like us. We can appreciate them. The extent of that is the extent to which we feel like we're looking in a mirror. So when we see the Greeks, we admire them for looking like what we see when we look in a mirror. Oh, how nice. I see myself. They must be good because I'm good. This is to be modern, right? Is it's full of self-praise, right? That the very name modern means that everybody else was primitive. We're the advanced ones. And so if we find a primitive culture and it has characteristics that we identify with ourselves, we go, they must be good because they're like us and we're good. And that's part of what he's trying to say. More specifically, what he's saying here is he's exploring this problem that the Greeks are a lot more complex on the subjects of mythos and logos than moderns are. Their relationship between the rational and the irrational is more sophisticated. It's more all-encompassing than ours is. We demonize the irrational and we canonize the rational. We say that math is good and science is good and laws are good and everything systematic is good, and anything that isn't that is bad and primitive and savage and is responsible for everything that goes wrong. This is the modern catechism. And so we look back at the Greeks and we're inclined to read all the text available to us as saying that they agree with us. Every place where they say something in praise of reason, we go, ah, yes, see, they're like us, and that makes them good. This is what he's saying in this opening sentence, right? But as and in this, and I'm glad that Stephen cited Nietzsche here. This is how Nietzsche started out his philosophy career, is thinking the Apollonian is good and the Dionysian is bad, like a modern does. And so he looked back at the Greeks, and you read the early essays in Nietzsche, and he's praising them for their rationality and their reason, how advanced they are. Part of what's fascinating about Nietzsche's journey is it's the journey that all of us need to take when it comes to, with regard to the Greeks, when it comes to understanding that that mirror that we see was distorted even before we looked at the Greeks. We aren't seeing ourselves clearly to begin with. But even if we were, when we look at the Greeks and see a mirror looking back at us, it's not an accurate depiction of the Greeks. I'm particularly fond of Dodds's book, The Greeks and the Irrational, and William Chase Green's book, Moira, Fate, Good and Evil in Greek Thought. I'll just post them in here again, because he's a nice corrective. These two authors are nice correctives for that modernist tendency to exaggerate how rational the Greeks were and underplay how irrational the Greeks were. And when we say how irrational we are, we don't mean how bad they were. We mean to what extent were they competent at irrationality, at precisely the thing that we're incompetent at. They were better than us in a lot of ways when it comes to their handling of the irrational. They appreciated better than we do how important it is and how incomplete you are as a human being if all you have to offer the world is rationality. So let me put these two titles in here. These are both titles that Kenneth Smith recommends. They're both on his lifetime reading list recommendations. So, this is part of what he's getting at with this opening sentence is, he's saying, we think that they're like us because we think that they were going forth into an irrational world and fixing it by making it more like the modern world, i.e. rational. And we say that makes them good. And that in seeing them as doing that, we see them as similar to when, we civilized Africa and civilized North and South America and civilized all the continents we went to and made them rational. We see the modern project as, upgrading the horrible savagery and backwardness of primitive peoples everywhere, and we're going to bring them the enlightenment of our advanced civilization that we will impose upon them because of our superior technology and science and reason. This is so. We look at the Greeks and we think, well, they must have been doing the same thing. Now, as we've explored in the previous sections, that's one of the pieces of evidence that that's not right is they didn't relate to other religions the way we relate to other religions at all. It's like patently obvious that they weren't doing what we're doing. And yet, despite how obvious it is, we still look back at them and see ourselves instead of seeing them. It's fascinating, right? It shows the power of the section we just came out of, talking about the power that our daimon holds over us, that our character really does control what we notice and don't notice. It's so strong that even the most obvious important things in the picture in front of us can still disappear into the background and not be seen by us at all. And what's left can then be so distorted by comparison with the whole that we're free to interpret it however we please. This is the significance of this opening sentence. Go ahead, Geneva, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I had a question, and it sounded like a good question until you threw in the whole heart of darkness situations. But I was thinking, are we wrong to think that because we have survived the ancients and the others, and have therefore probably evolved what they started, are we wrong to think that we're better or more advanced or in a better place And that question made a whole lot more sense before you threw in the whole part of our going to these other areas and civilizing the natives, because, and I thought, oh, darn, that just kind of vitiates my whole question. But I'm just, because I wouldn't necessarily agree with the whole heart of darkness thing, but
Right.
I'm just wondering, kind of like Hegel, like they were the seed, and now maybe we're the trunk of the tree. We haven't quite gotten to the leaves and the acorns and all of that stuff, but I'm thinking maybe we are better. I don't know. I'm just wondering.
So yeah, so there's a whole bunch of stuff that we've been indoctrinated in from our youth. And a lot of it is now out of sync with the most recent science. The classic example is evolution, and evolution was taught when I was first learning it, which was in the early 70s. I've been nuts for evolution since I was a little boy. Dinosaurs, right? Before, now every kid loves dinosaurs, but I was that back when nobody loved dinosaurs. I was that nerdy kid who loved dinosaurs, and it got me into evolution and studying biology and complex systems. When I was little. At that time, the depiction of evolution that was widespread in the literature was that evolution is a process of advancement and improvement, first of all. And this came partially from a generalization of Darwin's comment about survival of the fittest. We took, survival of the fittest has scientific legitimacy to the extent to which it's restricted to its original meaning, which is in the immediate circumstances that a species finds itself in from one moment to the next, survival of the species operates. But it does not operate as any kind of judgment about overall fitness or fitness for all possible circumstances. It has nothing to do with any of those things. So this is why, if you're in a climate that is really warm and humid, who's most fit for that climate is not going to be the same that will be fit if an ice age comes along. Ice age comes along, and the center of the bell curve where most of the species were, which were exceptionally good at handling warm, humid circumstances, are suddenly unfit, and they're all dying. And now it's the weird nerds on the edges who never could thrive under the previous circumstances, who find themselves, this is my time. I'm perfect. This is perfect for me. I never fit in the old order, but now I'm fit for this. And so I get to multiply, and, I become the most fit. And now the majority starts to resemble me rather than, where the center used to be. So the fitness issue in evolution is meant in an incredibly restricted way. But as moderns, our dogma forces us to rewrite Darwin so that instead of saying fitness for the immediate circumstances, we read it as a judgment on how cool we are. And whatever comes later must be better, right? There's the great march of progress from the muck and the slime up to, the, straight white cis European man with a receding hairline and a big beard and a PhD as the pinnacle of evolution, and everybody has to fit somewhere along that line back towards the slime. This was the 19th century, empire era version of evolution. And what was bizarre is that as late as the 1970s, outside of scientific papers, this was still the version of evolution that was being taught to popular culture. We all marinated in this idea that evolution was about improvement. Stephen Jay Gould is among the people who helped to overturn that. His books on this stuff are great, and largely the position now is that there's no great march of progress leading anywhere. There's no direction to evolution. It's about as things change on Earth, then species are suddenly, slapped in the species that previously were thriving are suddenly slapped in the face, and they have to change or die. And so there's a lot of zigzagging in the course of evolution, and it results in a very contingent history rather than one that follows a predictable line of advancement. And the classic example of this is two things. One is the the term living fossil, which you can still find people using it in the media, is now considered a pseudoscientific term. It's now considered not scientific at all. If you look at a coelacanth, and here's this fish that has lobe fins. And when the coelacanth was first discovered, it was called specifically a living fossil. Here it is, unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, dating back to the Devonian era when fishes first began to evolve legs so that they could walk on the land and become, us, presumably was the 19th century version of this. We now understand that they didn't evolve their lobe fins so that they could become us. They weren't interested in becoming us. We are not the necessary outcome of history, and that they're not stuck. They're not failed. They're not trapped. They're not a time machine. They're none of those things. What they are is a species that is so good at what it does, it didn't have to change. And this is the opposite of what we were told in the 1970s. In the 1970s, we were said it's a throwback. It's a failure. It failed to evolve. It failed to develop lungs. It failed to develop into a person. Therefore, it's some kind of failure. We're the success, and anything that doesn't reach us is some kind of failure or rung along the way. And we always said these are living fossils. They're less evolved. You remember more evolved and less evolved as terms. You can still find them in the media. We said it's less evolved than we are. And Stephen Jay Gould said, no, right? The world's been around 4.7 billion years. Every living thing alive is equally evolved. They are all the results of 4.7 billion years of evolution. Every last living thing you can find anywhere on the planet, right? And that the concept of more and less evolved was this 19th century, ideology that had stamped itself onto evolution. So now, instead of saying that the coelacanth is less evolved or is a living fossil, what we say, that what evolutionary biologists prefer that we say is that they retain more basal features. And those of us who have changed more have given up those basal features and replaced them with more derived features. And the fact that we derived our features from theirs doesn't make ours better and theirs worse. That was the mistake that we had made for over 100 years in evolution, was in imposing the value judgment that the more like us they are, the better, and the less like us they are, the more primitive they are. And so the second part that comes out of this is, this isn't about being adapted to the times, right? There's an enormous, to Zelig's comment in the chat, the times aren't the same everywhere, right? Where the coelacanth lives, people would suck. We would be awful at it. We can't live where they live. The reason that they haven't changed as much as we have in hundreds of millions of years is because they have found places in the world where they're the best there is at what they do. And the rest of us all suck by comparison. If we want to make a value judgment, we have to be willing to make it both directions. If they had been less able, if there weren't niches around today, like the ones from several hundred million years ago when they first evolved, then those species would have had to change. But instead of radical change, they thrived, right? And they still thrive to this day. They're still good at what they do. You see the same thing with the chambered nautilus. People talk a lot about the chambered nautilus and how little it has changed in hundreds of millions of years. And it's exactly the same thing. We used to say it is a primitive species. And now what science teaches us is that statement is pseudoscience. That's ideology. That's just patting ourselves on the head, disguised as science. And that actually the chambered nautilus is an incredibly successful design. It was what it was good at hundreds of millions of years ago. It's still good at. It's hit upon, a really great trick. And the rest of us, not having that trick at our disposal, have had to struggle more and change more. Now that we know how change happens, which Darwin didn't understand, we know that it is not the case that some species are more flexible than other species. It's not the case that some species are more adaptable than other species, and that they change in order to adapt because they're better able to handle change. That's not it at all. What happens when a species changes is that it gets basically nuked. The whole center of the bell curve dies out. It's a failure to thrive that results in the change. And it's the weirdos on the edges who then reproduce and move the center of the bell curve for the species somewhere else by doing that. What it means that a chambered nautilus or a coelacanth hasn't changed in hundreds of millions of years is that it's so successful that the center of its bell curve never had to be nuked. Nature never had to collapse their population because they were able to find the places in the world where they could be the best. The reason we've changed so much is that we come from a long line of, we say it's from a long line of survivors, but the other way to say that is it's from a long line of failures. And over and over and over, the center of our bell curve has failed, and the weirdos have straggled off into the distance and reproduced. And that has happened so many times to us that we don't look very much like our distant ancestors. So this has nothing to do with a meritocracy. And this is the second part that I'm trying to say about evolution, because what you're saying, Geneva, is incredibly important, right? I mean, what you're describing is incredibly important. It goes right to the heart of who we think we are as moderns and how our ideology works. So we like to think that we're the products of a meritocracy and that we rose to the top because we're the best. And so we rewrite history, we rewrite evolution, we rewrite economics, we rewrite everything to tell the same story over and over, so that all of the arrows seem to point to us and put a crown on our head or a halo behind us, right? We've got to win. But the conclusions these days of scientific approaches to evolution is that it is not a meritocracy. The dinosaurs didn't die out because they were dumb and slow. They were spectacular at what they did. They were amazing. They died out because an asteroid hit the planet and killed them. And, if an asteroid hits the planet, it might kill us too. They were unlucky. It's not that they were inferior. It's just that something very unlucky happened to them. And if that had happened to our civilization, we'd probably be gone too. There is, in the earlier stages of the modern epoch, let's talk about Hegelian worldview here, just to bring it back to Millennia and Microcosm. In the earlier stages of the modernist epoch, we were still very medieval. Right? We were just coming out of the modernist revolution, and most of our beliefs were still medieval, except for the handful of beliefs that had caused us to overturn the old order. And among those medievalisms was the idea that God created the world. An omniscient, all-powerful God made the world from nothing. He made it according to a brilliant plan, smarter than we are, and God doesn't make mistakes. Ergo, God wouldn't put a spectacular species out there and then kill it for no reason. So that must not have happened. Ergo, they must have been inferior. It must have been God's plan all along that we get rid of those inferior dinosaurs and replace them with superior mammals. So we rewrote the fossil record to make it fit the medievalist ideology of early modernity. And we've talked before about how any epoch changes its worldview over time. First, in the first third, it's all about rising to power as it pushes back against the old order that it's defeated. And in the center of its power, at its greatest heights of power, it's about feeling its oats. It's about, now I could get rid of the dregs of the old order that's holding us back, and we can be more perfectly who we are. And in the final third, it's about all the consequences of doing that and how everything starts to unravel because we didn't understand what was actually making our epoch work, and we're starting to inherit the unintended consequences of our actions. And that's where we are now. We're in the final third of the modernist epoch. So the way that we talk about anything, including evolution, changes over the course of that arc of our story. And in the early arc of the story, it needed to be a medieval version of modernity. And then it shifted to a purer form of modernity ideology. And now it's shifting out of that into we don't know what we're becoming. You never know in the final third because you don't know what's coming next. But it's shifting away from those things. And as the real juices of modernity start to fade away, the science is able to say more clearly what was always the case, what was always in the record, without having to stamp the modernist ideology on top of it and tell the story the way that we all like to hear it. So this is the thing about survival. Coming later just means you come later. It doesn't mean you're better in any way. There's on this front, one of the most amazing things about the dinosaurs, a little aside, is how from really humble beginnings, they were able to evolve spectacularly wild shapes. I mean, the frills, the horns, the long tails, the amazing claws, flight. And I'm going beyond dinosaurs if I'm including pterosaurs and the sea reptiles. But I mean, the diversity of shapes is just staggering among the dinosaurs. And frequently, these spectacular looking species evolved in just a million years or two. There'd be a real short period of rapid evolution, and suddenly some nutso dinosaur has grown a shield on its head, and you're like, what? What are you doing? Your predecessors didn't have a shield on your head. Where the hell did that come from? There is something about the dinosaur lineage that made it very morphologically unstable by comparison with a lot of other species that take longer to change shapes than they did. And it's admirable. If you're an evolutionary scientist, you look at these rapid proliferation of bizarre shapes and you're like, that's cool. that is a neat trick. And I wish mammals could do that. It takes us a lot longer to develop our changes than the dinosaurs did. So that they went bye-bye is no fault of theirs. We just came later. Now, having said all of that, Geneva, I still want to agree with you that the Hegelian concept that the new thing grows out of the old thing is true. It's true. I mean, as far as we can tell. Certainly that's the ancient perspective, which is the more important point, right? That we're trying to talk about what the ancient perspective is. And they saw things as being born out of predecessors. But I think the way to think about it is that the oak doesn't just follow the acorn. The oak also follows the previous oak. So you can look at an acorn and an oak and say, well, an oak seems to be better than an acorn, right? The acorn's this tiny little thing that can only grow into one tree, and an oak is this amazing thing. But remember, the acorn came from another oak. So, tree succeeds tree, if you will. And that sort of makes it clearer that it's hard to say that one is better than the other. There is change over time along with reproduction over time, but it's harder to call it a simple meritocracy or a march of progress. Yeah, peacocks, right? Another great example. The bird, now for anyone who's missed it, in modern classification, birds are dinosaurs. They're descended from dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs. And dinosaurs didn't go extinct. They're still around. They just grow these crazy feathers and wings and fly all over the place now and continue to be morphologically insane like peacocks. It's like, what on earth? How evolutionarily did that happen? So, all right. Long-winded answer to a short, simple question, but
very thorough. And thank you so much. It clarifies a lot, or changes the way I think about a lot of things now.
My pleasure. Yeah, I mean, I grew up with the Great March of Progress, and I've marinated it in it all my life, and I push back against it and struggle against it, and I've been struggling against it for decades, looking for where in me do I still believe in the March of Progress without realizing it. And despite working at it, it is like pushing a boulder up a hill. I keep finding, whether it's in art or in economics or politics, I'll turn a corner in my worldview, and there I am once again believing in a great march of progress and a meritocracy and all that. And it's like, no, none of that's true. That's not how any of these things work. That's just me reflexively stamping out the ideology without even being conscious that I'm doing it. It's everywhere. And I take that as evidence about the power that this ideology has over us, that it can so infiltrate almost any aspect of our understanding of the world, might turn out to have the Great March of Progress hiding in it. It's like fractals. You keep seeing the same shapes recreated over and over at different scales and in different places, and that's how ideologies work within our understanding of the world. There was a horror film out of Japan called Uzumaki, which means spiral. And it is one of the weirdest horror films because the object of fear is not a vampire or Godzilla or anything like that. It's the shape of a spiral. And it's about a town that becomes haunted by the shape of a spiral. Spirals begin appearing everywhere. People's hair starts spiraling. People start making spiral cookies. They get obsessed with spirals. They start shaping their own bodies into spirals. I mean, it is a nuts horror film. It's just bizarre. But one of the things I like about it is the way that it's almost like a visual representation of how ideologies operate within our minds, that they reproduce at multiple scales in multiple places all at the same time inside of our worldview, until once you know to look for them, you start spotting them everywhere inside yourself. This is one of the things about the challenge that Kenneth Smith's doing in this book, where he's trying to get us to understand how infected with modernist ideology we are without realizing it. Because it's everywhere, we don't think it's there at all. Like a fish looks everywhere and sees water and doesn't understand that that's water, because it doesn't know what it would be like if you looked around and didn't see it. That, in this horror film Uzumaki, everywhere they look, they see spirals until they can't imagine what a world would look like that didn't have spirals stamped all over it. And that's what it's like for us with our modernist ideologies, like the Great March of Progress. We're so used to interpreting everything as a Great March of Progress or a meritocracy, that it actually becomes sort of, when you start taking apart this ideology inside yourself, it becomes sort of shocking. You have this weird empty feeling for a while. You're like, how do I even understand the world if there isn't a Great March of Progress? What does that even mean? Who am I even? Who's America? What is science? What does it mean to be human? Every single question starts to feel like it's falling apart if you don't have these basic frameworks holding it all together. But that's what it feels like when you knock down one of the walls in the labyrinth. And suddenly you have this freedom of movement you never had before. And you realize that what was structuring your thoughts was always arbitrary and didn't have to be there. You could think in a different direction without the impedance of that ideology. Ideologies are one of Kenneth Smith's favorite topics. And it's all over this stuff. All right, Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up. You've been very patient.
Yes, I have been patient. But in any event, I had an original thing that I want to talk about, and you threw a kind of monkey wrench into it. But I realized it wasn't really a monkey wrench. It was a difference. And so my thought is, given what you said, is that human beings are not anything special, like any other species. But we, every species has a kind of a capability of sorts that allows them to survive. Human beings are not particularly strong or, fast or any of that stuff, but we do have one trick, and that trick is that we seem to have a mind that's very clever, and it's getting more and more clever. And the way we survive is that because we are not, as permanent, we have to constantly evolve, because we exist in a transitory state. In order to stay ahead of the thing, we have to kind of evolve. Because if you were a coelacanth, you don't have to evolve. I mean, you're perfect here, you're perfect then, you're perfect now, you're perfect in the future. So we have somehow lucked into not only this development of mind, but somehow lugged into discovering a kind of technology. And that helped us evolve, because what allows us to do it with that techne, and particularly in relationship to the mind, is to be able to ask questions. What does this mean? What is this all about? And that eventually what happened is that, that is actually the entry into metaphysics in a funny way. But we also have this thing which counteracts that to a certain degree. That's the objectification of things. And so therefore, what should have remained a kind of a transitory question in seek of an answer, we turn it into a thing itself. And I was thinking about this in relationship. It was through a discussion in quantum physics, but I was thinking about this in relationship to that, and how it was talked about that the instruments we invent to produce, I guess, the understanding we have. What's behind the instrument itself is actually an instrument of questioning. And that's one thing we don't understand. Like, we have a question, we provide an instrument that actually allows us to ask that question in a physical way. And therefore, we provide it, in a sense, an answer. And I said in the discussion, like, what's interesting is that the question is a necessary predicate to the answer. Just to have an answer, it doesn't make sense. I mean, you don't go to the oracle and just rattle off some answers like 45. What does that mean? 45. I mean, like, if you actually ask a question, okay, the answer 45. Okay, that makes sense. So it's incomplete if you just have answers. In fact, I think someday I'm going to go around just barking out answers. And I wonder whether these people who are, how should I say, are schizophrenic are that way. They just have an answer. It's like, what are they saying? And so I think we're so struck by science in a way as answers, that in a sense we forgot the question. In fact, the answer that is given, it's only partial. It's not a complete answer, because it requires you to ask another question. And so I said, so I coined the idea is scientific voodoo petit. At least it's not scientific voodoo Legrand. The small voodoo that's hidden within science and instrumentation, right? It really is, on that sense, because a voodoo, in a sense, projects an answer and as a question, but it's just sort of like a lot of it. It's just sort of like kind of mythic or make believe, And this is petite, we're isolated. We're just asking a small voodoo question that has no answers, and so therefore the answer is incomplete. We have to ask another one, and so that's a funny way of seeing science in a way that's non-standard, because we expect it to give it an answer, but it's actually in some way still wrapped into a kind of voodoo, and you could say that about anything, medical voodoo petite, right? Because we're still guessing. When you ask your doctor, and if they were honest, it's like, there's a 50% chance going to be this, a 25% chance going to be that, whatever, like, they don't give you like, oh, you will certainly be this way, right? No, they can't give you that. So until we have absolute knowledge and absolute understanding, in which you could say 100%, and that's exactly what they did in the oracles, right? Somebody comes in with a question, and voodoo is happening, and they give an answer, and answer is, of course, very vague and whatever. You have to now interpret it. And it's like, okay, that's exactly what we're doing. We're narrowing the scope, maybe, and we're asking in many ways smaller questions, but the question has to come first. And I do not believe that most people understand that you have to ask a question before you get the answer.
Right.
And that's a predicate. That is a predicate. And we have forgotten that. And we have structured a school system in which we give you the answers. and you fall into this voodoo world of
Right.
answers, and you
Right.
objectify, when it should be a transitory nature about moving from one idea to another idea, and that's embedded within the instrumentation of science, which is very interesting, because what we really want is what is behind the voodoo. That's what we really want, and yet we can't accept. Because if you tell a scientist, oh, you're just kind of doing voodoo, I mean, they're going to get very upset, right? But
Yeah.
what we really want is what's behind that voodoo that you are still veiling over us by giving us the answer. Now, scientists actually don't do that, because they'll say, like, it's much more complicated than that, but we want to boil it down to just give us the answers, please. Right? So I thought I would bring that in. That is our trick. And if we forget the first half of the trick, asking the questions, then it just doesn't make sense. Like I said, 68. What in the hell does that mean?
Right. Thank you, Phil. It's an excellent point. Stephen and then Zelig. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just going, there's a question there of historical progress. In Hegel, we have the modern idea of historical progress in a fully developed form. We see progress prior to that, but I don't know how well it fits into the idea of historical progress. That's certainly in Lessing, prior to Hegel. Lessing expresses it in a much simpler form. We do see ideas about progress before that. It's like Sir Francis Bacon's think tank, the Royal Society, was an idea of progress. But it still seems to be a sort of a Platonic view of progress that, here's this savage land, Scotland. We bring in our stuff, and we reduce some of them, the peasants. We drive the rest off into the hills, and we build a big manor house, and the noble lord comes out to inspire us peasants in what the good life is. And that seems to be it. The idea of progress before Hegel was of building up to just the level of the good life. And it stops there. So is there anything which discusses this concept of progress as how it evolved to sort of Hegel's view of the world? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I mean, I think there are many books to be written on the question you just asked. It's an area that's sort of a blind spot for us, because we're still enthralled by the concept of the Great March of Progress that leads to us. And so we're not really well situated to step back from it and look at the developments of these ideas as anything other than it's the obvious truth, and anybody who agrees with us is just seeing the world more clearly. This is how we're inclined to see anybody writing in terms of a progressive history. And we need to get over that before we're going to be qualified to say, why on earth would this crazy idea develop? Why would Francis Bacon be saying these things? Why would, to us, it doesn't have to be answered. They would want it because it's true. But the idea that there might be some other reason motivating it it's one of our surds. It's almost an inexpressible idea. If you think about the core of medievalism, there isn't a great march of progress at all. There's a fall from God's perfect Eden, and then there's God's plan for how it's all going to get fixed. And that plan has nothing to do with evolution and a meritocracy and all this other stuff that as moderns we're inclined to read back into it. And it's part of what makes it tricky if we're going to try to understand somebody like Francis Bacon in his time and place, smack dab in the middle of the medieval epoch. Say, why would he develop these ideas the way that he did? What did they mean to him? It's going to take some serious investigation to explore that. I think when you point out the idea of progress toward the good life, I think that's very astute, right? That's something any human being at any period would be predisposed to want and to understand. It's like here I am, let's say there's been a collapse in my village and things are not great. there is at least a minimal level of progress that I'm going to want just at a biological level, which is this sucks. I want a better house. I need some crops. I need clean water. And there is a feeling of progress. You're right. That's a big arrow pointing right towards things not sucking, the good life that we can see. But where did this other thing come from that goes beyond that into this idea that everything has to lead endlessly upward? I don't know, man. I think that question will be seriously explored for a long time to come. How did this set of ideas develop? Zella, go ahead. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, hey, it was nice. It's nice hearing you guys. And my first time. I've been listening to you guys for like a couple of weeks, but it's awesome.
Cool.
So I think I've been reading. I think Phil mentioned how the Greeks were enthralled with these numbers. That if they were irrational, they wouldn't, take them to account. I remember reading once that the Pythagoras heard one of its members mention one of these fractions, and they threw him overboard because they thought it was blasphemy. And I think I've been reading, and then reading a lot of the history of mathematics. One of the books that has really kind of gave me the perspective of what Wittgenstein came up to was called Mathematics for the Million. And it's a book that even Einstein recommended, and it just takes you throughout the history of mathematics. And I think what Wittgenstein was right when he opens his blue and brown books, and he says, when we say what is the meaning of meaning, it's no different than asking how much does certain things measure. Well, it depends what you're measuring with. If you measure with the 12-inch ruler, you're going to have 12 inches. But if you measure with the micrometer, you're going to be able to measure even smaller. And if you measure with the laser measurement, it's even smaller, right? And we can even go down to the atoms. And I think philosophically, I think philosophy with Plato and Aristotle, when it asks general questions about what the good life is, that's no different than saying, what's the measurement of my land? It depends what you're measuring with. And I think Wittgenstein was about the idea that when you ask ethical questions, the reason that we can't develop philosophical generalities, it's because different situations are unmeasurable. Only that person involved in that situation can have the nuances and the internal, the external. And I think that's one of the reasons I think philosophy has lost itself. I think as moderns, we think we can discover these generalities that other people can live by, and they eventually fail. And we find ourselves in a worldview where we look at the ancients and say, they were dumber than us. I don't know. I don't know, because I can't build a pyramid.
Yeah, right. Those were some smart dudes.
I barely understand calculus, and these guys understood the Pythagorean theorem. We don't know how. They don't ever. At least the Egyptians and the Babylonians don't tell us how they discovered it, but they did.
Right.
And I think one of the difficulties that we are facing in modernity is we have no general guidelines as to how to live our lives, right?
Right.
Who we are no longer under that, what would we call that kind of Christian worldview, at least in the West. And we're kind of what Nietzsche said, right? That we don't know where there's up or down or left or right. We're just in the middle of this nothingness, and everyone's fending for themselves. And we tried to look at the ancients and say, they had it so well. Well, not really. They also looked at the way they measure things according to a worldview that allowed them to function. That's why they wouldn't accept irrational numbers, because it wouldn't allow them to actually create things that worked. If they started accepting micrometers when they didn't have the technology to measure that small. And so
right.
I think in terms of there's so many things that you guys talked about that it's really a microcosm.
Yeah.
And I think looking at it from the Wittgensteinian perspective, I believe that I think philosophy is just a way to teach us that, because I got a biology major, and something that they taught me early on is you first start with the scanning lens when you're looking at an organism. You don't start with the 100x
Right.
observation, because you will never be able to decipher anything. So you
Right.
start with the general lens, and then when you discover that area that you want to look in a little bit deeper into, you start zooming in.
Right.
And I think philosophy is just that tool to tell us when to zoom out to get the bigger picture of whatever issue you want to deal with. And then once you kind of got a general area, you zoom in. You
Right.
apply science, you apply mathematics, you apply history. That, to me, that's what philosophy eventually should have gone to. But then it started getting into the world of Plato, where he tried to come up with these grandiose ideas and grandiose schemes where he said that people were born slaves, right, by nature, and some people were born to be rulers. And I think that's where kind of philosophy started going in a different path, that we saw what the 20th century was, and we're suffering in the 21st century that we no longer have a schema to respond to that hierarchy like the one you were talking about. Like, we're no longer there. We completely are without any schema. We're kind of in the existentialist world of you kind of make your own reality.
Yeah, it's part of what's interesting about the premise of Kenneth Smith's book here is that he's trying to get us to step back from being in at too detailed a level and to ask ourselves the broader questions of what even is the modern epoch? What are the assumptions that we take for granted that we don't know that we're taking for granted? So he's basically, trying to apply the corrective that you're talking about and say, we're way in here trying to micromanage each other's behavior at the level of how many dollars do you owe for X or Y,
Right.
which law exactly did you violate, and we're failing to ask more broad questions such as, why should you have to earn a living? Do you not have a right to live? Is that have moderns decided that human beings have no right to live and they have to rent their existence on Earth? And he's trying to take us to step back and say, well, how did other people answer these questions at different epochs, and how's that different from how we do? Maybe we can learn what we're taking for granted. So yeah, it's one of I'm thrilled you're having a good time, that you're enjoying these discussions. We've been doing them for a while. One of Kenneth Smith's lines about philosophy in general and what it is he divides it into two categories. He says all philosophy is either existentialist or escapist. And the trap that philosophy has slipped into in the modern epoch is that it's become escapist. It's about trying to describe how the philosopher believes people ought to be and how the world ought to be and how God ought to be, and then claiming that it is that way because it all makes sense and the numbers add up and the logical syllogisms look right. And he says the thing about the older philosophy, the existentialist philosophy, is it starts with the assumption that who are we to dictate terms to nature? Who are we to say in advance, I have a beautiful system and it explains everything? We should be more inquisitive than that and more humble and ask more basic questions like, what am I prepared to know or not know? What am I prepared to understand or not understand? And how should these kinds of decisions be made? So he would agree with you that there's a serious problem with modernist philosophy. And it's part of what this book is about, is trying to explore exactly what those problems are. So we'll keep going, and I hope that you enjoy this discussion and that you join us for future ones as well. It takes a while to pull apart the whole tapestry of what's at work here. Why don't we do Donald and then Stephen next, and then I'll go back to the text. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, I was just shocked to hear somebody try and introduce philosophy into our discussions here. But in thinking, it depends on what you're measuring. Well, to quote Pythagoras, man is the measure of all things. Of course, I'm not sure Pythagoras had a good idea as to what that meant. He meant it unphilosophically, perhaps, but it certainly he didn't mean by it that know thyself, or he didn't mean by it the unexamined life is not worth living, because he was mostly into selling sophistry to rich kids, running a private school or something. but it was, I'm trying to actually agree with Zelig here a bit, but that there, and this is also what I think Kenneth means when he says we need to be existentialist. We take ourselves, we have to learn who we are. And you know, we don't get to turn over a rock somewhere and find that God carved the answer on the bottom side of it and tells us who we are. Just, you know, yeah, man is the measure of all things. The other thing is, I'm not sure where you're going with not irrational numbers. I think the Pythagoreans, I'm not sure. I don't know much about Pythagorean philosophy, but I've read a great deal of Greek mathematics, and they certainly tried to deal with the irrational. In fact, that's what Plato takes up in his dialogue Theaetetus, where he goes against Pythagoras, because Pythagoras there is presented as saying man is the measure of all things. And Theaetetus and Socrates, you're like, okay, here are two lines. You're the measure of all things. Measure them. And of course, they're irrational. They have no common measure. This is sort of a joke, but it's a funny philosophical joke for people like me. May not be a joke for anybody else, but I kind of, oh yeah, that's right. They knew that Euclid has a proof. I'm pretty sure that 2 is irrational. They knew that. In fact, they knew how to construct. Using a semicircle, you can construct the square root of any length of line by adding 1 to the length of that line, a unit to the line, do a semicircle, and then raise a perpendicular point at the point. And that line will be the square root of the longer side of that diameter. This sounds terrible. I can't believe I'm saying things like this. I spend too much time trying to hide this. Not show this. You know, this is part of, but anyway, Zelig, it was nice to hear you ask these questions. I think I don't think I'm going to go read Wittgenstein. No, I think I own one of his books and I broke my brain on it earlier. But yeah, it's not the case that I can read Wittgenstein. So,
but for Selig's benefit, Donald has read a lot of Plato.
Yeah.
If you have questions about what Plato says,
well, I caution you on that. My interpretation of Plato coincides with none of the traditional commentaries on Plato.
that just makes you interesting.
So
That means you're not redundant. That means you're essential to the conversation.
no, but
Does he look like a Plato, Donald Plato?
I don't think Plato had I don't know. No, Plato was a very broad-chested. In fact, Kenneth kind of looks like what you might think. Plato was called Plato because of his breadth, I think. He was a powerfully built man. Kenneth has that build that you might associate with, that wide shoulders, large chest. I'm a kind of a thin guy. Not now, but I was.
In our 50s and 60s, we all stopped being.
Yeah, I stopped.
We were in our 20s.
You know, I had actually something to say, and I've gotten so sidetracked here.
You lost it, didn't you, Donald?
I did. Yeah, dementia. It's coming to all of us soon.
Irrational numbers will do that to you.
Irrational numbers, yes, but they were of interest. They were of interest. They were well known. They were learning how to categorize them, how to compare their magnitudes. I think they were, it's like, it's like when you said, I've not read any Sumerian or Egyptian derivation of the Pythagorean theorem, although I think they've actually found plumb bobs and construction tools that, they should know them.
Yeah.
But the Greeks, and sorry, I wouldn't say just while you say the Greeks, I would say any Greek aristocrat would have studied all of the mathematics at the 5th century or 4th century, and they would have had a rigorous proof of the Pythagorean theorem. So that may be getting us off, because that's part of this conversion from mythos to logos.
Right.
Right. This idea that now the irrational's not mysterious. We can compare magnitudes of irrational numbers by comparing the squares of the irrational number, which we can construct and which we can measure.
Ergo, we have converted the irrational into the rational.
As Plato says, the saving art of measurement.
Yes.
So
let me add just this one bit. Like I was going to be a airplane mechanic before I chose to go into the health field. And one thing that you're taught early on in airplane mechanics is that you're always measuring in micrometers, at the thousandths of an inch, right? And
Right.
So I think that if you look at it philosophically as to what is the good life for an airplane mechanic, or what is the good life for an airplane, it would be the thousandths of an inch, because without thousandths of an inch, you cannot make engines work in an airplane. You cannot make metal sheets that would actually work well. And I think philosophically, the question of what is the good life for men is no different than what is the good life for an airplane, in my opinion. And then my answer would be thousandths of an inch would make an airplane work. Otherwise, if you can't measure thousandths of an inch accurately, you're going to kill a lot of people, which leads to the bad life. So I think that's so I think that's what Wittgenstein meant when we asked when we go to an airplane and we ask, what is your good life, airplane? The airplane, if he can talk back to you, would say thousandths of an inch, everything. You know what I mean? Like that is the good life. That it's an airplane functions well when everything is in that realm of thousandths of an inch. Whereas men is a little bit more difficult, because we go into the world of qualities, right? Where we can't reduce our emotions to thousandths of an inch, but it's even deeper than that, right? It's even more complex. And so the tools are psychology, right? We try to Freud tries to come in and tries to go even deeper into the world of the psyche to try to understand us in a very, very deep way, right? Not a shallow way. And so I think that's where philosophy works, where I think Wittgenstein would say, know what is the appropriate measurement, right? So irrational numbers didn't serve anything to the Greeks, but to us as moderns, who actually can go from one place of the country to another country in a matter of hours or days, the irrational numbers, like the way they call them, we need them. Without them, we wouldn't exist. So I think that's where I think philosophy lets us know that it's all depending on what you're dealing with, who you're asking the question to, that is relevant, right? Irrational numbers are relevant for airplane mechanics, like anything, like they live by them, right? They live and they die by them. So that's what I think philosophy should be about.
Well, I think the thing there is that human beings are self-measuring to greater or lesser degree, but they construct their own rulers that they apply to themselves.
I would say that ethical life, yes, but when it comes, for example, to the body, right? We know that a certain amount of blood is required for the heart to pump, or we know the certain amount of fluids you need for your brain to function. Those are always going to be within a bell curve, right? We know the average. And so I think those are unchanging. But as far as our ethical or moral life, our spiritual lives, yes, those are going to be immeasurables, right? We can't really measure them. People in Wall Street wish they could be measurable, because it would make billions of dollars to know when the market goes into fear, when it goes into joy, and then they would make money on that. But it's I think only in the physical aspects of our bodies can we actually do measure, whereas the other spiritual qualities, I think those are immeasurable. Well, what the Greeks would call immeasurable, right? Incommensurables.
Yeah.
Commensurables. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, and don't we have advertising to sell ourselves happiness? Don't we have an entire industry devoted to this?
Right, the likes buttons and the high fives and all of that, right?
I'm going to mute myself. If not, I should probably just disconnect.
Well, on that cheery note, Stephen, and then Phil, and then we'll go back to the text. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, my big lesson here, and it's something I've understood before, and there's probably quite a lot of lessons here, but one of the big lessons in this whole work, and it's something I've sort of understood before, but you can see where people have gone so wrong. Like there was famously the Azaria Chamberlain case where a dingo took off with a baby. And nobody could believe it. How could a nice little puppy dog, a wild dog, they're nice little puppy dogs, savagely take a baby and eat it? Because that was so rare back then, people couldn't accept it. The whole legal authority of the country just couldn't accept that fact. There had to be something wrong there. One person commented there was a thought going on there that bad things don't just happen. The only reason bad things happen is because people intend them. That was the dominant thought. Accidents don't happen. Bad things don't happen by accident. There is some evil force out there, some human secretly working away, making all the bad things that happen. Now, I remember when I was a kid, I got a little kiddie tent with a cowboy and Indian printed on the side and stuck it out in the backyard and sat on the grass early in the morning, put a blanket down on the grass, and there I was in my own little world of humanity. And I was thinking about all the nature around it and how I was connected with my parents for survival. I was living in a human bubble that works for the human. And I thought, how would I actually survive in nature? Not terribly well. I could sense that, yes, there's that human world, but outside it is nature, which is vaster and huger than what humans create. Now, Smith is warning us in here, and I have heard the warnings before, but he's putting it at great point. The world of nature is different from that of the human perspective. But modern humans cannot accept that. They keep on trying to project their humanity onto nature or anthropomorphizing it. And we can't help that. We've got to keep a warning sign up there. Alert, alert, you're anthropomorphizing again. Now, this was Schopenhauer with Hegel, when Schopenhauer, a very arrogant individual, unfortunately, dismissed Hegel. And he was warning it. Hegel is thinking of everything from a very ideal point of view. And the audiences loved it. Tell the audiences what they hear, and you will fill the lecture theatre. And Schopenhauer was saying, well, no, we don't exist or live for ideal reasons. people don't get married and produce children for an ideal, because most marriages end up being miserable. You'd have to look at a marriage and think, why do they bother? To rear progeny. Nature is the boss, not us. This was Schopenhauer's warning. And yeah, this distinction between humanity and nature is just so often lost today. They won't even accept that what we are as human beings, as Schopenhauer was trying to point out, is the ruling spirit of nature. But humans, modern human, thinks they're the rulers. They think that they're the boss. And yeah, this is a big warning Smith's trying to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I'm gonna build on that in a moment after I call on Phil. I've got a pair of examples, and it'll bring us back to we're still, just for those following along at home, we're still in the first sentence of section F. And when I after Phil does his bit, I'm gonna circle us back around through the coelacanth back to the Greeks to show why we're on the first sentence. There's an enormous amount to unpack here. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I was in a way glad that the discussion went into mathematics and irrational numbers and all that. Not that I'm an expert in it, but nonetheless, you know, the difference between the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Babylonians knew, in a sense, the hypotenuse. I mean, they knew that. So did the Egyptians, as a practical manifestation in the world, but they didn't have the theorems. In other words, the argument, the theory, that the proofs that was true. And the theorems was very important in this sense, because the theorems introduce a kind of argument against the divine world, the gods. You know, we have the measurements, we have the secret. So we could now at least have a discussion. And I actually think Kant's categories are the same way, you know. It's kind of like we are begging the relationship. And in fact, I kind of think that categories are maybe not actually real in the world, but maybe they are just sort of like the necessity for us in terms of creating understanding. So is mathematics. Now, I think Donald and I have a disagreement. I think mathematics is still on this side of the divider line, and I think Donald believes is in the other side. And I'm willing to actually negotiate the difference. And the difference is what's called the nominal world. So Heidegger's horizon has now been expanded into a gray zone. In other words, there is the existential world that we live in, there is the transcendental world, and there's the nominal world in which we are beginning to encroach into the thing. And and I think the nominal world is kind of important. And I wouldn't want to discount, because it's not necessarily real, but I wouldn't discount it, because it's the zone that, in a sense, allows for speculative thinking, in a sense, encroach into the transcendental, in a sense. But so then I wonder if this encroachment of the speculative philosophy, the speculative science, or speculative whatever, is that approaching some sort of relationship to the real, or is it a derivative of the mind and the categories? This is the equivocation I want to make, because when you're in that gray zone, that's sort of like beyond the horizon, but not way beyond the horizon, then in a sense, I think that's why you have to invent the world of the distinction between actuality and reality, right? Because The gray zone is the actuality of the possibilities in relationship to the probabilities. And the reality is, in some sense, transcendental to that. And so you try to match it. And I think in some way it approaches matching it because it is at least an argument that allows you to, in the conference room, to talk with God and say, let's negotiate, right? I mean, before that, you can't negotiate with God. What God said is like, that's it. Like, you're just wrong. Just follow my laws. And now we have like a little, like a secret weapon, I happen to have a get out of the jail free card. It's called the nominal world. And in fact, I'll go along and expand this to the relationship with the mythos and logos, if you want to go there in a sense. The Greek gods were, in fact, nominal beings. They were not real. There was a law above that. They were, in a sense, in between zone already. So before mathematics, which made the nominal world into a statistical norm, so to speak, mathematical logos construct, there was already the mythic actuality of the nominal world. So we do now have a nominal world. I got this actually in because I've been very interested in economics now. I generally am not, but I'm very worried we're in a very, very tricky situation. And I see that money, in this very chaotic world, I'm a very conservative investor, it turns out, I did not realize I was so conservative. I'm mostly out of the market, but I'm not totally out of the market because we know if you stay out of the market with interest rate at 9%, nominally you got the same amount of money, but you have less purchasing power. So the nominal reality does not match the actual reality, right? So therefore you say, oh my God, this is really a derivative, is not real, at least in that sense, right? So unless you either collapse it back to the mean line, of the commodities, or else you spur the economy by flooding it with more money. So in some sense, at least the nominal exceeds the actual. Then in a sense, you're at least keeping pace. So that gray zone is kind of an important place that we all live in. This is what the Christians would call purgatory, right? It's neither heaven or earth. It's sort of somewhere in between in the mind. You are living in purgatory, and God says the beating will continue until you straighten out. So purgatory is back of the woodshed.
Yeah.
So this is what you're dealing with, like you want to bring in your get out of jail free car. No, the beating will continue until you straighten up. So it's become a farce. It's a comedy. It's a dark comedy that we're all living in. So this is what I have to contribute in relationship to mythos and logos. The beating will continue.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Phil. All right. So we've been doing this for 2 hours on the first sentence. Let's take a little more time on the first sentence. I'm gonna circle us back around for this discussion. And I'm gonna start with evolution. And what I want to point out is the ways in which we imposed our ideology upon the evidence to create a mosaic that seemed to be a picture of reality. And it satisfied us. So we said it must be true, but it never was true. And more modern interpretations, more recent interpretations have disrupted the more ideologically modernist, pure interpretations of the fossil record. and shown that the truth is messier. And that's going to be the case looking back on his first sentence about the relationship between the Greeks to moderns, that just like the coelacanth doesn't fit into the great march of progress that leads to us, we're going to discover the Greeks also don't fit in a tidy place in a great march of progress that leads to us. So let's start with the fishes. Like jellyfish, which I adore, jellyfish, enormous numbers of the things that we think of as basic to animal life evolved within jellyfish. You can find jellyfish that have eyes or don't have eyes. You can find jellyfish that have more or less muscles. You can find jellyfish that just sort of float around like passive objects in the ocean and luck out if something swims into their tentacles. And you can find sea wasps that actually chase down fish and catch them. There's like an enormous amount of difference within jellyfishes. And that represents huge spans of time and evolution. The development of, dreaming, for example, sleeping and dreaming appear to have evolved in jellyfish. All kinds of stuff. Well, fish, what we think of as fish, are similarly another amazing group. I mean, they developed heads, they developed jaws, they developed all kinds of features that we think of as necessary to being a human being. And until the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, we had fish placed into a very clean, tidy spot, right? Fish are primitive, and amphibians are more advanced, and reptiles are more advanced, and mammals are more advanced, and then there's us at the top, and there's this great march of progress that leads up. And in order to make that work, we said, the development of legs and lungs was so that a fish could become an amphibian, which obviously they would want to because it's better to be an amphibian, right? Obviously, because it's more like us. So this must be what the fossil record shows us. When we found coelacanths with their little lobe fins, we said, it's a missing link. Remember the term missing link? It's a missing link between fish and amphibians, right? And that proves that evolution is real because, the great march of progress is thus illustrated with an in-between form, between fishes and amphibians. And when we saw lungfish, we said the same thing. Another missing link, right, between gills and lungs. So, obviously the lungfish and the coelacanth are somehow fit in between amphibians and fishes. And that's how it worked. That's what we were teaching in the 70s. But this is, first of all, not true. And second of all, not how it worked. What happened is we had the fossils and we had the ideology. Bye, Sharon. See you next week. We had the fossils and we had the ideology. And so we arranged the fossils to fit the ideology into this little linear march. But what have we learned since the 1970s? Well, let's start with the swim bladder. You're going to love this. The evolution of the swim bladder. In the 1970s, they said that lungs evolved from swim bladders, right? Swim bladders are how fish just stay buoyant in the water. And obviously they're primitive by comparison with us. Lungs are more evolved. And, we can see if we study evolution and comparative biology that no animal has both a swim bladder and a lung. The advanced ones all have lungs, ergo the lung evolved from the swim bladder. This is what we were taught in the 70s. And although they used fancy words to say it, that's more or less how cartoonish the discussion was. But what we have discovered is that that's not how it worked at all. The swim bladder evolved as a pocket off the stomach originally. And the purpose of the pocket was to gulp air. This is before swim bladders. Right? The first evolves this pocket off the stomach, and it evolved to gulp air originally, not to stay buoyant in the water, because the way that oxygenation happens through the gills, then circulating through the entire body, and only then reaching the heart, meant that a common problem of early fishes was that the heart wasn't getting enough oxygen, especially when they were exerting themselves heavily. So they developed the ability to gulp air. They'd swim up to the surface when they're exerting heavily, gulp air, hyperoxygenate their gills, which hyperoxygenated their blood, which improved the amount of oxygen that was reaching the heart. This comes before lungs, and this comes before swim bladders. First came oxygenation. Then there was a split among the fishes between the ones that began to develop lungs and the ones that began to develop swim bladders. Both the swim bladder and the lung are descended from the original pocket off the stomach. First came gulping air, then came swim bladders. And lungs didn't evolve from swim bladders. They evolved a different path off of gulping air. They evolved, you're gulping air, but now you'd like to get better at gulping air. You'd like to absorb more of the oxygen that you're gulping. And so the lungs begin to get more complex and get more surface area so that they can suck up more of the oxygen out of the air that you've gulped. Two different paths. Lungs didn't come out of swim bladders. It was two different paths. And for example, if we look at cartilaginous fish like sharks, they don't have swim bladders at all, or lungs. They have neither one. They didn't develop the pocket off the stomach, and they didn't do the gulping of the air. That was just not part of their evolution. So this is a huge change. I mean, if you're trying to arrange a sequence of who's primitive and who's advanced and who evolved from what, we got this dead wrong. The lungs didn't evolve from swim bladders. Lungs and swim bladders are basically sibling structures that evolved from something else, which was more like lungs in the first place. It was the gulping air thing. The second thing is the coelacanth, right? Let me put the coelacanth in here because we need it. It's important. When I was a kid, I read about the coelacanth all the time. I knew the whole story of its discovery, when they found it off of the coast of Africa, and they were amazed because they only knew it from fossils, and here it was swimming around in the ocean, and oh my God, heads exploded. People like, it's a living fossil. And look, it's almost like it's got stubby little legs. So this must be the ancestor of all of us. And whenever you see those little things on bumper stickers where it shows, you know, they take the Jesus fish and they add legs to it, right? And it'll say Darwin in it. This is still the symbol that people use for evolution, that the, you know, the stubby little lobe fin fish is halfway to becoming an amphibian, and thus, you know, more advanced than a fish and on its way to becoming us, which is most advanced of all, according to the modernist ideology. And we, you know, we rationally, intellectually applied our ideology and our model to the fossil record to make this make sense. But here's the problem. Turns out we didn't evolve from coelacanths. They're their own branch of fishes. And we now know a lot more than we knew in the 1970s. And it's just patently obvious the coelacanths are their own line of evolution. They didn't lead to us. That's not where we came from. They're a cousin species, if you will, that evolved lobe fins, not in order to walk on the land, but in order to have lobe fins. Turns out lobe fins have advantages of their own. They exist for their own reasons. They didn't evolve in order to become legs. They evolved for their own reasons, and they were done evolving. That's it. That's where they went. You know, if we wanted to insert the coelacanth into the missing link between yeah, I know, right? It's a sin. You could see me being joyful every time and I'm joyful, not because I'm pointing the finger at somebody else who had this blunder. I was the one who believed this. I was the one telling everybody, you know, I embraced this completely. I told people all the time that the coelacanth was a missing leg. I'm joyful at finding my own defects and being able to move on and get out of those things. And I want to share that joy with you all so you can find it. So why did the lobe fin evolve? Well, not in order to become legs, because that's not the line that leads to us. What is the line that leads to us? Well, here's the first thing that it's hard for a rationalist to understand. The progress of evolution of life on Earth is not all apparent in the existing organisms alive today. There have been many, many more species than there are now, and most of them have gone extinct over time. And that includes vast swaths of species with shared characteristics that may at one point have been the norm, but they're almost entirely gone now. In some cases, they're all gone, and there's nothing left except fossils. And if you don't find a fossil, you really have no evidence to look at to show you the connect the dots picture that leads to us. What we have since discovered over the eons, over the decades, not eons, is that there was an early stage in the arrangement of the continents where it didn't block the currents that run across the equator. It would route it up and down, but it was able to make a full circle around the Earth. It can't do that now, right? We've got North and South America blocking the equator equatorial currents, and we've got Africa blocking the equatorial currents. Twice they're interrupted, and so climate conditions on Earth now are really different from the way they used to be back in the Devonian, Silurian, Devonian eras. Back then, the equatorial currents could mostly circulate, and warm water easily circulated across the entire planet. The conditions on the planet were warmer overall. They were more humid, they were warmer. Also, the continents were in a different configuration, and there was an enormous amount of shallows. These days, we have a lot of places where the continental shelf drops off into the deeps. And it's caused the evolution of different kinds of species. But back then, there were a lot of shallows. There were a lot of places where the tide regularly throughout the day would swarm in across many, many miles of shallow waters and then swarm back out when it went towards ebb tide. Now, you could find places on Earth that do that today, but those places are, we can mark them because they're not the norm. But you go back to the Devonian era, and there were enormously more places like that than there are now. In those places with shallow water and strong currents, there was a lot of plant life that grew up. Before plants colonized the land much, they were colonizing these shallows. And because of the strong currents, they had to develop strong grips on the ground. Are you with me so far? Because if they didn't, the currents would sweep the plants off, they'd lose their footing and be dragged out to the ocean next time there was an ebb tide. So you began to develop all of these vertical plants with stems and very strong root systems in the shallows. The types of fishes that thrive in environments like that are not the types of fishes that thrive today. In order to thrive in those environments, fishes needed to be able to not just be swept in and swept out. They needed to be able to control their motion through these massive tidal flats. They began developing the ability to grip onto things, not in order to get onto the land, but in order to stay where they were in the water through these massive currents. We've now found fossil after fossil of all of these, this whole branch of fishes, none of which exist today, that would grab onto plants and not be swept away. It was to control their ability to move through the shallows that we don't have much of anymore. And that was why they developed those. These guys were a completely separate branch from the lobe fins. It's obvious that they were, when we look at their physiology and anatomy, it's obvious the lobe fins never had any part in this. And these are the animals from which developed amphibians, because after all, they were already spending their time in the shallows. They were already developing gripping features, not to walk on the land, but just to be able to hang on. Once you've got gripping features, well, getting onto the land is a whole lot easier than if you've just got a fin, right? So there is a contingency to the evolution of amphibians that we recognize today in modern evolution that we didn't appreciate in the 1970s. In the 1970s, we wanted a rational sequence of developments in which each thing evolved so that it could evolve into the next thing. We were thinking backwards about evolution. But now we're starting to understand the way it really works is that you aren't evolving so that you can evolve something else later, which is what we were thinking according to our ideologies. You're evolving for your immediate circumstances and the problems that you have to solve right now. That's why you evolve. And this has taken generational turnover. I mean, if you guys have read, Thomas Kuhn on the structure of scientific revolutions, and the way he says that new ideas in science don't evolve because they're more persuasive and they're more right and people change their minds. The new ideas develop because the old generation that absolutely refused to accept the new ideas dies out. And the new generation grows up and they're familiar with the new ideas and they accept them. And that's how scientific ideas turn over time. It's not this rational process of persuasion and evaluation that we think it is. And that's what happened in evolution. The diehards who were absolutely stuck in the modernist Great March of Progress died out. And they were replaced by people who were willing to accept the evidence of the fossil record, which is that, yes, it would be tidy if lobe fins and lungfish were placed directly into this spot in our Great March of Progress, but they aren't. That's not how, it didn't work in a rational, tidy way. That's not how any of this developed. And so I explain all this in order to go back to his first sentence and talk about the Greeks. we are interested in history as a story that leads to us. It's not that all people are, but moderns in particular are obsessed with themselves as being the pinnacle of history, and history as being a rational process that leads to us. And that the farther back you go, the more irrational things are. And the closer you get to us, the more rational we are, because rational is good and irrational is bad. So when we look at the Greeks, what jumps out to us is, look at these features that they have that remind us of us. They must be a missing link between our glorious selves and the horrible slime of the past that we evolved out of culturally. That is to say, we do to the Greeks exactly what we did to the lungfish and the coelacanth. And we said, your purpose must be to help explain us. And that's how we're going to read you. And whenever we read the Greek texts and we see something that doesn't fit that picture, we sort of forget about it. We go, I'm not sure what that was. He was mumbling or something. But whenever he says something that fits our picture, it hits us clearly and it stands out. And we go, wow, look at this guy saying this modern thing. They're like us. They must be the missing link. They're our ancestor. And therefore they're good because they lead to us. All of this is what he's trying to say here in this opening sentence. There's a reason why he's talking about, in science, in law, in bureaucracy, in economics, that moderns are trying to rationalize everything. They're trying to purge all of these aspects of culture of anything natural and unexamined. And they're trying to replace it with ideology. Say it must be systematized, it must be documented, it must be mathematical, it must be logical, or it's bad, because we're so obsessed with noesis, with the rational logical products of the mind. And so when we see Greeks in the classical era engaging in noesis and examining things, when Socrates says, what might as well be our catechism, the unexamined life is not worth living, we are joyful. We're like, yes, he's singing the song of our people. He must be one of us, right? That's what he's saying here. And in saying this, he's not saying the words, but he means them. We should be thinking of the story, of Procrustes, and the way Procrustes would invite guests into his home. And what you're supposed to do with your guests is to treat them well. But what he did instead was reshape his guests violently to fit his bed, whether stretching them as a rack or cutting parts off of them until they perfectly fit the bed. And then he liked the tidiness, that everybody fits the preconceptions that he has. And Procrustes is how a modern sees the world. A modern wants the world to fit the ideology, so we cut and parse and edit the evidence, throw out the evidence that doesn't seem to fit our ideology, and highlight and exaggerate the evidence that does, until what we seem to have is a world that justifies our ideology by seeming to comply with it. And this is the way in which he's telling us that we're misreading the Greeks. Or to use a more modern metaphor, Maslow's hammer, right? We're like the guy with the hammer, and everything we look at, it has to be a nail. And so we look at the Greeks and we see a nail. We see modern junior. This is modern's junior, and we like them because they look like us. But in fact, that's not what they look like at all. We just can't put down the hammer and stop looking at them like a nail. So what he's going to do in this section is help us to get past that and see them the way that they really are. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, before I say what I want to say, I want to just ask you a brief question about what you said about the tidal waves. The way I understood the tidal waves washing inland a long distance was that the moon was at one point much closer to the earth. So therefore, the force of the tides was much stronger. So is that just not right? Or how does that coordinate with your explanation of what the tidal waves and the flow? That's a question first. I just want to get that straightened out. It's complicated. Is it whatever?
It's fairly straightforward. Generally speaking, it's true that over time we can demonstrate that the moon is moving a little further out. Mm-hmm. It's swinging, infinitesimally, but over the tens and hundreds of millions of years, it adds up. It's getting further out. But the thing that's hard to grok is how recent multicellular life evolved on this planet.
Okay.
Almost all multicellular life is only 600 million or so years old out of 4.7 billion or so. So most of the time when the moon was closer, the only living organisms on this planet, as far as we know, were single-celled. All this stuff with fishes and tides is much, much later.
Okay. That,
For
that explains
example,
that part. Yeah.
Did you ever watch Carl Sagan's Cosmos? The TV special series?
I don't think so, but
It's a really interesting series in which he kind of talks about the philosophy of science, and you know, a remake of it was done in 10 years ago or so by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and in both of them they talk about the concept of a cosmic calendar, where you try to map the duration of the entire universe onto 1 year of human life, and you say, if you did that mapping, you know, when was the Earth formed? When did fish evolve? You can put it as a date on the calendar. I've actually put that on my calendar. I've got one. I guess I could share it on Google Calendars, make it public for people, in which I go through and find all of these different species that evolved and say, well, what date was that? So mammals, which evolved pretty early on, about halfway back towards the Devonian era we're talking about, only evolved today on the cosmic calendar, December 19th. I cleared that this morning off my calendar. These fishies that we're talking about only evolved earlier this month. You know, most of the year, there weren't any significant multicellular organisms, and that was the time when the moon was really closer. So it's not so much the proximity of the moon as it is just that the orientation of the continents was such that there were much stronger tides and there were much longer shallows. I live in the Seattle area, and you got Puget Sound here, which has got this one inlet and a very extensive network of fjords, if you will. And so when the tide comes in, it has one of these long impacts where it's going all the way up these long tidal sections and up these fjords. And in a few places, we even have tidal flats. And so that when the tide comes in, it goes for miles, not just a few feet, but miles of racing in. And if you ever go out to a place like that and stand there in waterproof boots, you can really feel the tug of the waters. And all you have to do is imagine, what if in hundreds of millions of years ago, the way the continents were configured, that sort of thing was the norm, and it was all over the world that there were flats like that instead of just a few spots.
Well, in asking my first question for you to straighten that out, I have not forgotten what I was going to say, so I'll come back later.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No problem. No problem. I'll come back.
Okay, we'll come back to it. Zelig, and then we'll go back to the text. Go ahead, Zelig. Come off mute.
Yeah, when you were mentioning how moderns look at the Greeks and they see themselves, right? I remember reading philosophical manuscripts of ancient Greeks that you actually find some philosophers that would speculate that we come from fish, right? And you're like, oh, look, this is what I've learned in biology class.
Right. Right.
And you're like, or like the atom theory, right?
Right. Democritus.
You find, you're like, oh, look, that's actually kind of what we believe. But at the same time, I think at least in the West, I think that, just speaking for the Western mindset, it's a reaction against the Christian worldview. Like if you look at it, right, in the medieval era, they looked at the Genesis model and talked about the first day God created the heavens and the earth, right? The second day, third day, fourth, fifth, sixth, on the sixth day man was created. And I think if you look at modern Western man, he's trying to do the same thing. He's trying to say on the first millionth year, this created. On the second million year or 600 million year, this was created. And I think this was true what Nietzsche said, right? We killed God and now we're gods. At the culture, or the geist of the culture is that now we feel responsible to try to explain the beginning, middle, and end of the universe. And the question is our scientific tools enough to give us insight as to the past? Because we're discovering, right? I don't know if you guys heard of the clone of the little sheep. I don't know if we've done this recently. They cloned the little sheep, and it turned out that if you will look at it at its genetic level, at its cells, it actually indicated that it was much older than how long it was actually around, and it actually died quicker.
Right.
And so we can have situations in biology where at the cellular level, it's telling us that it's a certain age, but as to how much life has it actually lived, not as much as the cells say. So
Right.
is our
Right.
scientific tools enough to tell us about the nature of how old or how young the universe is? I don't know. Are we being Procrustean with the scientific tools? And so I think modern man, because he has killed God in the Nietzschean sense, now feels that he has a burden, that he must explain the origins of man. And that's, to me, it's like we're finding more with the advancements of science that we, like you're saying, right? These categories that we had that were all neat turned out to be not the case, because we cannot have everything explained. We cannot go back, said Bertrand Russell. Questions of the origin are forever hidden from us, right? Because we just can't go back. And so are we being Procrustean with the modern scientific tools, the way the modern man thinks? And I think the answer is tilting to, I think we're using our modern tool to try to figure out questions that is not meant to answer. It's like asking a hammer, what time is it?
Right.
It
It's
doesn't
nail
follow.
time. It's hammer time.
It's like it doesn't make sense, And so
Right.
I think modern man is starting to find out that he is not God.
Yes.
And that's leading him to a crisis of, okay, if I'm not God, then what am I? Well,
Right.
science doesn't tell you anything. It just tells you the way things are working. Your heart's supposed to pump blood and you're supposed to have oxygen, but that's it. It doesn't tell you what the meaning of life is or how old you are or where you're heading.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these are challenging issues, right? And part of what's shocking about the section that we just finished, we were talking about Heraclitus, is the extent to which Heraclitus is able to, in detail explain why it is that Homo sapiens has trouble seeing reality for what it really is, and why we tend to impose our own sleepwalking dream upon reality and prefer that to the reality that's there. Even though we're swimming in evidence to tell us what the world is actually like, we do this really sort of aggressive selection of how much of the evidence we're willing to accept and what we're going to hide. So, it complicates questions too, like even answering the question, what are the limits of science? We again run into questions like, just because we call what we're doing science doesn't mean that it defines the full possibilities of what science could be. Is this science, or is this the maximum science that modernity will permit? That science has to be shackled to the ideologies of modernity and is not allowed to ask certain questions. Like, if science wants to ask questions like how to make a better gun, we'll fund that research. But if science wants to ask questions like, what if, is modernity a mistake? Should we do a different kind of political economic organization? Modernity is going to not fund that, because we would rather not hear the answer to that question. We've already supplied an answer, which is we're the best there ever can be, and shut up. It's basically, what our ideology has to say if science wants to ask certain questions. So, one of the things that comes out of Heraclitus is this idea that the character of the person controls what we're able to notice or not notice, what we're able to take an interest in or not take an interest in. Just like modernity can be interested in how to make a better gun, but can't be interested in how to replace modernity. We don't want to hear that question. We don't want to hear the answers to that question. We take no interest in it. So you get into Heraclitus and Hegel, and they start saying, well, yeah, a person has a character, but a family also has a character, and a neighborhood has a character, and a culture has a character, and an epoch of history has a character. That's the zeitgeist that Phil was talking about before, and the whole species has a character. And at every level of these things, all of these organisms with their respective characters are editing what they're able to notice or not notice, care about or not care about, understand or not understand. And this is an ancient perspective. on the human condition and our problems. It was the ancients who thought there was this complexity, this structure, and to how we notice or don't notice things, and explored what were the implications of that for what does it mean to be human. As moderns, we've thrown out all that sophisticated modeling of, you know, our limitations and capabilities, and replaced it with the stupid, you know, man is a machine and the brain is a computer model. That's the current dominant orthodoxy, and it doesn't prepare us in any way to understand why do people so consistently misunderstand some things while understanding others. How can someone be so smart about some things and a complete idiot about others at exactly the same time? Our model of intelligence is it's a thing you either have or don't have. You have a certain amount of it, and if you have it, it applies to everything. This is the modern conception of intelligence. The idea that intelligence isn't a volume like water or gasoline that you have more or less of. The idea that it has a structure that predisposes it to be good at some things and bad at others, and that it's not random, but it reflects the character of the person whose intelligence we're discussing. This is outside the modernist orthodoxy. We don't have we can't represent this. We don't have a place for this. We want all people to be the same, right? Statistically analyze the average person, and the average person is the real person. And any deviations off the average, those are anomalies, and thus we'll put them on a shelf and not talk about them. It makes it difficult for us to summarize what's possible or not possible, because we only do so within this framework of modernist interpretation. Phil, I gather that you remembered the thing you were going to say, so come off mute and tell us what it is.
Yeah, I did remember, in the sense that delay was a good one in some sense, because it's exactly the thing that you were talking about just now. I think part of the problem with modernity, and I consider myself a modernist, so in some sense I'm speaking against myself in a way, is that I previously said the question is the predicate to the answer. And I think what is wedded to technology, so it's actually technology-driven science, is that the answer precedes the question that gives the answer. It's a feedback loop. And I'll give the example. When I came to this country, you know, I'm a very bad reader, and I still am a bad reader. I think partly because I'm just constructed slightly differently. And I remember taking this reading development, you know, remedial course in reading. And the teacher told me the secret to reading. Okay. And the secret to reading is, you know, read the first paragraph or thereabouts, and you are going to find a topic sentence. And she said, forget about reading the rest of the thing until later. Go to the end and find the conclusion. Then you will have the answer for the questions that are in the middle. So in some sense, the topic sentence should be at the end. Because like everything is a search for the thing, because you don't know what the questions are. You ask the question, but the question is much more open as dimension.
Right.
And in some ways, I think, in a funny way, I'm going to tie it back to Parmenides. I was thinking about this the other day. I was in a discussion with somebody, and I says, you know, being is, that led to a question. But when you ask being, when you say being is, which presumed to be an answer, is an objectification of a verb. Being as a verb, is a verb. Is.
Right.
That's what it's actually saying, right? And so we have frozen a transitive relationship into a thing. We have a purpose of doing that. So I think the whole thing about dialectic presumably was to uncover and reopen being is into at least an evolutionary thing of questioning.
Becoming is.
Yeah, becoming. That's right. Becoming.
Right.
So to open up the is as a noun into a verb. So
Yes.
that's interesting. But the opening up of that, in some sense, create a kind of a delusion too, because Heidegger talks about when you go into nature both divulges and hides, right? There's a covering over. So when you're asking the question in the wrong way because you constructed this sort of structure of, let's say, the topic sentence, and then the middle, and then the conclusion, you answer the question that you already were answering to begin with,
Mhm.
which is what technology is. And so, in some sense, and asking that kind of question, which is actually an answer, then in a sense, you have covered over. You are revealing, but you also are covering over all the other questions that could have been and should have been asked.
Yeah.
And it's covered over. And I remember saying this, and I was having a discussion. Once again, I'm not into authoritarian cultures, but we were talking about communism. And we were specifically talking about China. By the way, I'm not a devotee of Chinese thinking. I mean, Chinese has always had a kind of hierarchical structure, even beyond communism. So the thing they do is they have a control of the media, right? Absolute control, feedback loop, and they know everything and they control the system. And I said, well, that's a pretty dictatorial system that, in a sense, don't allow for any kind of free thinking. True. Okay, true. And I said, we have, instead of using hard power to control thinking, we have soft power.
Mhm.
Lure people into the goodness of pleasure.
Mhm.
And they will stop asking the other questions. Yeah, everything's going good. I have plenty of food, got vacations and all that stuff. And all sorts of things will be hidden underneath the other questions you should have asked. And so we don't oppress people, we suppress people into hiding the question that should be asked, such as, is there actually equal justice for all sorts of people?
Mhm.
We didn't need to ask that. like that's irrelevant. I'm having a good time. I'm getting. Now, the reason why I'm beginning to ask that question more seriously is because we have been destroying the middle class. So they're going to say, oh, well, we're also suffering. I mean, if the middle class was doing well, forget about that riffraff. In a way, we don't need to ask those questions. So in some sense, I think we've done a terrible thing in terms of destroying the middle class, even the working class. The working class was always hoping to go into to the middle class. So in some sense, we have destructed ourselves by misusing soft power in a
Mhm.
funny way.
Mhm.
So in some sense, I think that the question becomes how do you oppress people? Do you use hard power like the Chinese? Or do you use soft power by hiding the other questions because they are irrelevant? You want to ask just the question like, am I getting enough money to get the stuff I need,
Right.
to do all the things I want to do, that sort of thing. So that's interesting. So that's what I'm saying is yes, you have to think about what that question is, that the question is a subversion of the true questions by having the answer before it is well, we want you to ask the question, how do we develop a better machine gun? The answer is at the end.
Mhm.
The question has been truncated. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Phil. So everyone who's got their hand up and has a question, I hope that you will remember the question that you have and hang on to it for a little bit. because I'm going to take us back to the text. Because it's been 2.5 hours. I thought maybe we can move on to sentence 2. Just, hypothetically speaking. And so I'm gonna take us through a couple of sentences, and then we'll come back around for questions. So don't forget what it is that you mean to ask. I know how easy it is to forget because there's all this creative ferment in these discussions, but see if you can hang on to it. So given that first sentence, his follow-up basically says what we just spent 2.5 hours saying. He says the Greeks seem to reflect our own modernly rationalized perspective back to us across the ages. And he says seem to reflect because he's trying to emphasize that that's not the truth of the Greeks. That's just what we see. That's how they appear to us, the seeming of them, if you're us looking at them. He says, but in truth, that impulse to rationality that the Greeks had, in contrast, he's saying here, in contrast to our impulse to rationality. He's saying it's different from ours. That impulse to rationality is nested in an utterly different kind of matrix in the case of the Greeks. Right? One of my favorite sayings is that information out of context is noise, right? What something means depends on the larger picture. It's like a gun is just a gun unless it's a play and it's the first act and the gun is on the mantelpiece. And then that gun's going to be fired before the end of the third act because Chekhov says so, right? The story has a structure. You're never shown something for no reason. You're only shown things that are relevant to the story. The gun takes on a new meaning in the context of a play that it doesn't have in other places. And this is what he's saying here, is that there is a context to Greek rationalism that gives it a meaning so different, so significant, that ultimately it's a different kind of rationality than the rationality that a modern has. We look at them and see ourselves in miniature, or a missing link that leads to us. But that's because we don't understand their context. And because when we look at them, we are looking for that rationality and not for the context. The context fades into the background. And thus, we don't know how to properly interpret their rationality. And that leaves that rationality free for us to misinterpret as a nail for us to hit with our hammer. Right? All of this is implicit in what he's saying here. He's talking about the way that instead of seeing the Greeks, we see a caricature of the Greeks that fills an ideological purpose for us and encourages us very strongly, if unconsciously, to misread everything that we read about them so that their rationality seems to be leading to our rationality. So I'm going to take us to the end of this paragraph, and then we'll spend the rest of the time talking about people's questions and so on. It says, as a high energy and acutely creative culture, and in saying this, he means the Greeks are unusual in both of these regards. The Greeks ran through millennia of cultural evolution in centuries, if not in generations. So this sounds like he's just saying the Greeks are cool and they're good and let me praise them. But what he's actually trying to say is something very specific. What we think of as the classical age of the Greeks was a brief period of Greek history. It was preceded by a long dark age, and that was preceded by a long Mycenaean age, which is the traditional setting of the Trojan War, the epic of the Trojan War, for example. And what we think of as the classical age of the Greeks was followed by, in fact, overlaps with the beginning of a long period of civil war in which the different city-states of Greece were at war against each other, tearing themselves to pieces until ultimately they're conquered by the Macedonians, who usher in the Hellenistic age. This terminology, Hellenic and Hellenistic, needs to be emphasized a little bit. Now, the Greek age, the classical Greek age, is the Hellenic age. They didn't call themselves Greeks, they called themselves Hellenes. And the Hellenistic, not Hellenic age, is an age that is imitating and derived from, and in some ways resembles, but is not the Hellenic age. What Alexander did was inspired by the Greeks, but different from the Greeks, right? He transformed Greek civilization, he transformed Greek culture, what happens during the period of the Library of Alexandria, although we think of it as moderns, we may think of that as, oh, it's the Greek period when they had the Library of Alexandria. No, that's the Hellenistic age that came later, which is different from the Greek age. What he's talking about here is the classical Greek era. It was brief. It was a short period of time. And in that period of time, they ran through, really archaic philosophers like Thales and Anaximenes and the like, and Heraclitus, all the way into, rationalists, and I'm exaggerating here, but, more rationalist philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who wrote at greater length and with greater explication than the people who preceded them. Likewise, the cultures themselves, when we study their politics and their economics, there's massive transformation from the 600s and 500s to the 400s and 300s. In just a few centuries, they become almost a completely different people. And so when he says high energy, acutely creative, rapidly changing, this is what he's referring to. He's not just trying to pat them on the head and say, look how adaptable they are. They must be good and better. He's not trying to say any of these modern value judgments. He's trying to say they were not one thing in the same way that Nietzsche doesn't have a single philosophy. They were thinking about things and changing their minds about things and transforming themselves rapidly over the course of this period. And if you're going to try to understand any moment of the Greeks through that rapid period of change, as though that were the sum total of the Greeks, you're going to misunderstand them. Later, they're more rationalist, but earlier, they're more irrationalist. That is to say, later they engage in logic and math and noesis, but earlier, they're doing more with tragedy and song and dance, theater, storytelling, epics, right? Mythos and logos is the name of this section, and we're seeing a rapid transformation from a mythos culture to a logos culture. So when a modern reads the Greeks and says, oh, look how rationalist they are, right off the bat, that's not true, right? Because they're changing. They're many different things over a course of time, and the later things are growing out of the earlier things. This is what he's trying to warn us about. Yes, we imagine the Greeks are the glorious dawn of who we are, and we're inclined to erase from our consciousness any part of them that doesn't fit that description. So he says, just because they were a people culturally predisposed to seek fundamental principles or archi, comma, and I got to pause here and say this is a classic Kenneth Smithianism to say, to presuppose something that actually requires some explanation. They were a people culturally predisposed to seek fundamental principles or archi. They tended to not get lost in the details as easily. They tended to obsess over what are the ultimate causes of things? What is the character of things? What is their nature? What is their lawfulness? They were obsessed with these questions from an early point, long before they became rationalists. Even when they're, doing tragedies and songs and paintings on vases, they're obsessed over what is the character, the nature of these things that drives them to behave the way that they do, right? So he's saying that they were a people who were predisposed to that. And because of that, the Greeks in every phase of their development, whether early or late, sought the most radical forms of explanation. They're not, we think of them through Aristotle, we think of them as a people, who are harmonious and balanced and calm and obsessed with the golden mean. But if you read Nietzsche on the Greeks, he would laugh and laugh in your face and say the Greeks were incredibly emotional. They were full of joie de vivre. They were full of emotions. When they were enraged, they would raze cities to the ground and kill everybody in them. Right? They weren't just calm. They were many different things, and were those things to the fullest. And among the things that they were is that they didn't look for placid, calm, compromising, milquetoast forms of explanation. They always wanted the most radical explanation. And that's how you can have a bunch of Greek philosophers sitting around debating the nature of things, and one guy invents the idea of atoms. Democritus comes up with this idea of atoms because nobody else was saying it. He's going to the root. He's going to the, he's trying to dig past all of the accepted common sense explanations. He does not value and, you know, coming up with an explanation that will make the maximum number of people agree with him. He values coming up with the most radical explanation that seems to explain the most things. And thus he comes up with atoms, right? Which nobody else is talking about. You see the same thing basically with all of the early archaic philosophers, that they're trying to get to the core principles that are the causes of all things, and they don't care who they trample on their way to get there. And in this way, they're not like moderns at all. Moderns are obsessed with, am I going to be able to pay my rent next month? I can't bite the hand that feeds me. I can't rock the boat I'm on. I can only say the sorts of things that aren't going to endanger my ability to rent my life for another month. But the Greeks don't care about any of those concerns at all. They're perfectly happy to say something that shocks everyone around them, if it seems to strike to the heart of the issue. It's not shock for shock's sake. They really want to get to the roots. That's what he means by radical, right? When Kenneth Smith uses the word radical, he's quoting Marx, where Marx says, to be radical is to go to the root of a matter. What is its character? What are its archive? What are its principles? What's the essence of the thing? Forget the details. Let's start with where is the core of the thing, the beating heart of the thing. And that's what he's talking about here. And then we wrap up this paragraph with, and by the way, in this sentence, he's already describing a form of rationality completely alien from modern rationality. Our rationality is obsessed with pragmatism. We want to be rational in order to get rich, in order to pay our rent, in order to get along with our neighbors, in order to build a better gun. It's always mediated, like the Romans would be later on. It's about helping our will accomplish what it wants to do. We're willing to be rational to the extent that we get the rewards of pragmatism out of it. But in this sentence, he's saying the Greeks are not pragmatic. He's saying they're obsessed with the causes of things, the roots of things, the nature, the character of things. And they were that way since long before they were rationalists, even when they were irrationalists. Maenads dancing in the forest, tearing poets limb from limb, are obsessed with the roots of things, their archive, the fundamental principles. And later, when Plato and Aristotle are writing their, carefully constructed rational arguments, they're still writing about the roots of things. So their form of rationality is not our form of rationality. It's for different reasons to accomplish different things, focusing on different parts of the picture than we would focus on. So when we look at the Greeks and see ourselves, we're misunderstanding not only the Greeks, but we're misunderstanding ourselves in order to misread them as the missing link that leads to us, our great glorious selves. And so he culminates in this paragraph in they present in archetypal and concentrated form the dynamic of cultural evolution, vigorously and concisely expressed. In this, what he's trying to say is things that in another people or epoch, courses of development in history that you would have had to study thousands of years of history to see. You don't have to look that long with the Greeks. You can look at just a brief span of centuries, or in some cases, just a turnover from one generation of philosophers to the next. And you can see them radically transforming themselves rapidly in ways that other cultures also do, but they take longer to pull off. Implicit in this is something that he stated earlier in this book, which is part of the reason that we go back to the Greeks. It's not because they're so important for forming us, but it's because they changed so fast, so consciously, and they were obsessed with death, including the death of their culture. They looked back at the great age of the heroes. They saw that it had died. They saw that there had been a long dark age. They knew that their success during the 500s was going to be brief. They feared it. They wanted to try to avoid it, but they feared that it was going to happen anyway. And so this is the thing that makes them interesting. They became obsessive diarists. They logged, they wrote down what was happening. Like somebody exploring the South Pole or climbing Everest for the first time. They're like, This could go very badly. I think this is going to be very important. I'm going to set down my thoughts here so that if I fall off a cliff, somebody else can read this thing and know what happened to me. And the Greeks were doing that through this period of rapid evolution. What makes them interesting is that they were self-documenting through a period of rapid change. And it's because of that self-documentation that we can look at the Greeks and see that they are not the people that moderns try to read them as. Because the Greeks said all these things that he's saying about the Greeks in this paragraph, the Greeks said about themselves. They talked about the way that they developed reason out of irrationality. They talked about the struggle between mythos and logos culture, between gnosis and noesis. They wondered whether it was a good idea, what they were doing when they tried to rationalize everything. They debated it and argued it. All of these things were open subjects of discussion, which is what makes it all the more interesting that we can read that text and not see any of it and just see them as primitive forebearers to ourselves, just missing links that lead to us. It shows you the power of our own ideology over our thinking, that the Greeks can literally be telling you what they're doing and we can still not see it, even though they're laying out all the evidence. Because our own character, remember, this is the section F comes right after the section on character. Why is this the opening paragraph of section F? Because our own character as a modern is so strong and distorting of our ability to see reality that it distorts our ability to see the Greeks who they are as who they are, despite the fact that the Greeks' own character is also equally strong and pronounced and easy to characterize if you didn't have your own character standing between you and them and preventing you from seeing them as they actually are. Right? There are people who are mysteries and difficult to read. They're introverts. There are people who don't write diaries. There are people who you could wonder, who is this person? There's just no evidence. There's people who produce no written literature. We may never know who they were. But here are the Greeks telling us everything that's on their minds as they go through rapid changes. And still, even armed with that, we can't see who the Greeks are because our character is so strong. It makes us rewrite what we're reading to turn it into what we expect to see. And that's why he's writing this book, to help us learn what is that character in us as moderns that makes us misunderstand even something so obvious and dramatic as this particular example of this people. Now I'll go to questions and we'll carry that through till about quarter after. So Zelig, why don't we start with you? Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh yeah, what you're mentioning reminds me of a principle that I learned from an author called Philip Reeve called the feeling intellect. He said that unless you can feel intellectually what Nietzsche was saying when he said, what if the world was a woman? If you cannot get into that world through your emotions and your reason, you're not going to be able to understand what he's saying. And I think that applies to understanding the Greeks as well. Unless you can use your mind and your emotions, right, and put them together, you're going to be able to see who they were for who they are, not just our own categories and understanding of what they were saying of themselves. And I think and that's to help us understand that we should be trying to answer questions that are fitting for our era, not trying to solve problems for the Greeks era. And so it makes me think of what we were saying before, like, why is it that today's education system doesn't fund, for example, the philosophy department as well as it does its STEM projects? And I think it's because, to be honest, they're stuck in the Cold War mentality. while we need to actually have a generation of young thinkers to be able to help us solve ethical questions. Right. And that's because we're trying to fight a Cold War from the 20th century of the 1950s with Russia, and in our news media and all of that tries to control our dialogue as to why we need to fund the STEM projects and why we need people to know of rocket making to defend ourselves.
Right.
And to be honest, I think I've done a lot of thinking as to what would be the best way to organize ourselves. And as someone who's a biologist, to me it amazes me, why don't we just simply organize ourselves according to our organs, the brain, the heart, the lungs? Like, why is it that no philosopher, as to my knowledge, I might be wrong, has not come up with the philosophy of politics from the body, from our own organs. We always try to either look up to the heavens or look down to the earth to try to come up of a body politic, but never have we looked at least in our era. I think we really do have the opportunity in our era, unlike any other era, to organize our societies according to our biologies. And I think that would solve a lot of problems. Instead of, Marx thought that he can come up with some Hegelian dialectic in these classes and struggles. I think we should just rule ourselves according to our biology. If we only, as moderns, think about, let's use our findings as to biology to apply to our society.
It's interesting what you're pointing out, because, a physicist, someone who studies physics looks at politics and says, why don't we organize it according to physics? And a chemist looks at, politics and says, why don't we organize it according to chemistry? And what we discover is that the human mind is incredibly malleable. We have an amazing ability when we develop a field of knowledge to draw metaphors from that to other fields.
Well, would you say that at least in the biology science, it's holistic, right? It looks at anatomy and physics, it looks at chemistry, it looks at the physics, right? There's some physics to our biology as well. But I think if we look at the way the body works, it always tries to seek a balance, right? If you're bleeding out, they'll send histamines to cure you. If it sees that it doesn't have oxygen to your brain, it'll start pumping glucose to your brain so that you can be able to work around the lack of oxygen. And so now you can work to be able to think. And I think if we organize it, not necessarily just the separated sciences, right? Just physics or just chemistry or just anatomy, but I think of a holistic approach as to the whole body, where the term body politic is not just a metaphor, but literally a biopolitic. And if I wonder if there was some philosopher, unfortunately we don't have the funding in our philosophy departments, if a good young mind can come with the philosophy of politics that comes out from observing how the brain works, observing how the heart works, how the lungs work, how even the most insignificant parts like our little toes have a vital important part in our development, can that be translated to our societies as moderns, instead of trying to go back to the Greeks and trying to say, oh, look, this is why a monarchy works, or this is why totalitarianism works, or this is why democracy works, instead of saying, hey, let's look at our biology and let's see how the body works, and let's try to translate that into our society. Where does that mean that certain people are the brains? Yes. Does that mean certain people are the eyes? Yes. Does that mean certain people are the hands? Yes. And let our bodies ultimately be the structure in which we organize our societies to make modernity work, because it's not working. We're using old paradigms, and it's failing. I think that's what comes to my mind.
There's an interesting critique that agrees with you on this, that says that maybe the early modern era was the era of metaphors from physics, where people thought, the important thing is force, and you want to push force this way to push something else another way, and that the thing about these kinds of physics calculations is that these kinds of metaphors are very simplistic, whereas the kinds of societies and economies and ecologies that we're having to wrestle with in order to survive are more complex things that aren't modeled as well by physics. Maybe they're modeled better by biology or ecology or what have you. A whole movement arose in the middle of the 20th century called the cybernetics movement, which in hindsight we think from the name must be about computers. But when you actually read their stuff, what they're actually talking about is trying to come up with metaphors from biology and ecology instead of from physics. We've talked a little bit about Gregory Bateson. If you haven't read his work, you might want to. Also, you can find work by his daughter, Nora Bateson. And I think you'd find it very interesting, because they're trying to bring a biological, ecological perspective on politics and so forth. You might really enjoy them. The other thing I wanted to say about what you said is your reference to the feeling intellect is right on, because Kenneth Smith, among the modern philosophers that he reads is Philip Reef. And he recommends those works. So,
I read everything from Reef.
Yeah,
everything,
exactly, right.
From Reef,
I've got all his books downstairs for that reason. So anyway, thank you for bringing that up. Since we're past the 2 o'clock hour, I'm not going to explore any of these ideas as much as I'd like to, but I want to at least have people have a chance to mention them, and then we can carry them over to next week. So Stephen, and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm still on my great mission to define what rationalism is. I must say I've spent 30 years stirring up the local philosophers. But finally, when I came up with this question and said, you guys, you talk about rationalism all the time and reason, yet you don't really understand the meaning of the word. Finally, after 30 years, they're building the funeral pyre for me. They're ready to string me up. And I'm not even really trying to stir that much this time. For the first time in big numbers, I've really put up a relevant point. And that's what's made them angry. Because the thing is, I'm saying, well, you're idiots. But the thing is, I am aware that I'm an idiot too. I'm aware that we're all idiots. We're born idiots. We live as idiots, and we're probably going to die as idiots. But we can, try to understand things a little bit better in the meantime. And I studied a bit what rationalism was 30 years ago, and I haven't pinned everything down, but a lot of what is going on is 99% of what people are calling reason and rationalism are not reason and rationalism. I'll give you an example. They cannot distinguish between idealism and rationalism. Rationalism and idealism are closely related, but they're different things. True, rationalism takes a set of ideas and measures them. These are the good ideas, these are the bad ideas. It's a process. The trouble is that they mistake too often. Our experts have already worked out what are the good ideas and the bad ideas, and dogmatically they stick with that. This is dogma. Right. They've forgotten the word dogma here.
Right.
Rationalism is a process. And looking back, I wish there was a word for the laws of physics, one single word, because we have rationalism and we have idealism. See, the rationalists are proceeding on the idea that there's a perfect world of rational ideas out there, and we only have to climb our way up to them. This is another huge mistake they're making with the idea of rationalism, that up there's a flying spaghetti monster of reason, and we only have to ascend to that thing. But yeah, I'm still asking for, can people put up the definition of rationalism, the history of rationalism? Now, the other thing is, too often people, well, I'll give you an example. A rationalist will come up with a rationalist basis for morality, and they'll say the greatest good for the greatest number.
Right.
And I think, really, I look at the evolutionary scale, and I've seen how nature has treated the greatest number. It's thrown the greatest number in the waste bin.
Right.
But the rationalists will say this is the divine law, the greatest good for the greatest number. Sorry, I would say that's an idealism. That's not rationalism. That's not reason. Reason is a process, but I'm afraid you might have come up with a wonky answer.
Right.
And I think we are in serious trouble here on this question. Because I brought it up again because we're dealing with the question of reason and rationalism again. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, the recurring theme, and necessarily so. It remains a theme from cover to cover in this book, and it's in part for the reasons that you're underscoring, that moderns so identify themselves with reason, and everything we do must ipso facto be rational. But as you are pointing out, many of the things that we do don't actually hold up to the test of reason. and are not actually rational. We just simply assume that they are blessed with rationality because we did them, and we're rational. Ipso facto, they must be rational things. There is a deep foundation of irrationality underneath our rationality, and as a result, we are remarkably ill-suited to explain what rationality even is. As you point out, you ask people to explain themselves, and they can't. This is a recurring theme in among the Greeks. Diogenes, right? Diogenes spends a lot of time interrogating the Athenians to see if they measure up to their own standards that they claim for themselves, and finding that they don't, and saying, not only don't you meet any of your more sophisticated standards, I can't even find one honest person. You're all lying to yourselves. And if you fail at that test, you're certainly going to fail all the more sophisticated, complex tests. And, he could get away with that because it was the ancient world and he didn't have to spend all his time earning a living. In the modern world, we have very carefully eliminated survival niches like that, so that we don't have to be plagued by a Socrates or a Diogenes or anybody else who wants to ask us the uncomfortable questions. Nobody's exempt from the relentless hunt to try to buy another meal and another month of rent. Phil, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed out the difference between the earlier Greeks, the pre-Socratics, and the post-Socratics. That was a very, very important dividing line. And it seems to be located, I'm not quite sure whether it was located in Socrates or Plato. I think it was Plato. I happen to love both art and philosophy. And that's really the relationship between the body and the mind. And I'm wondering whether both art and philosophy deals with this, what I previously called the gray zone in both the mythic and the logos, in a sense. And whether that is in that sense, the nominal world I already talked about, in some sense. And they both claim that space in one sense. The problem is if you move too far into the mind, is you get a kind of separation from the body. And it's the body, in a sense, I think, what is it? The phenomenology is very important, because we need to talk about the relationship between the interior and the exterior. The exterior is something that we actually have no access to in reality. All we have are the phenomenological effects or the impressions of the exterior, in a way. And once again, that's the gray zone. And it seems like we could infer all sorts of things from it and build a relationship. And I kind of think that the arts are closer to the external world, the exterior, and philosophy closer to the interior. Well, I can't say that, because I think art is close to the interior as well, but closer to the mind. Let's put it that way, in some sense. So the relationship between mind and feelings is a relationship between, in a sense, the transition from the exterior into phenomena, into the mind and into feelings. And I kind of think that the shortcoming of philosophy, in some sense, is that it gets perhaps a little too distant and gets too wrapped up in the mind. And not that that's bad, because I love philosophy, but I think that's why you have to exist in both worlds, in some sense, because philosophy does seem to dissect the hidden. Now I'm getting into the, presumed to in a sense uncover the hidden principles underneath. And science does that to a certain degree. But on the other hand, like I said, it also covers over a lot of other things that are hidden within that. And you begin to wonder whether the hidden variables are actually something that, in a sense, it uncovers, or whether the hidden variables are something that it created that it's trying to rediscover. I don't know. I remember once, I'll give an example, because I think the important thing in philosophy and in any of the rational thinking is that you are presuming to discover the forms that, in a sense, the rules of the impressions, in a sense. And the forms are important, but the forms must also somehow be mutable. It can't become rigid, in other words, become more and more stultifying. And I remember, and I'm a formalist, so, but I understand that the forms must also transform itself, okay, in that sense. I remember there was a visiting artist that came to the Youngstown State. She was a pretty decent artist, and she was showing some, I think, drawings of hers, and we were looking at it, and it wasn't me and just her, but it was an audience. And she looked at it, and I pointed out, like, what's happening in the left, the right, the upper right part of the painting, the drawing. She says, I kind of have a problem with that. Well, why don't you fix it? Well, it just sort of ran into the frame of reference, the forms. And I agree with her. I said, well, but have you not thought of, let's say, taping another piece of paper in that area and just go beyond the forms?
Right.
I mean, I actually said that. Like I said, I'm a formalist. I believe in the forms, but sometimes you have to extend the forms into some other areas. So that's a relation between the representation and the forms, right? Because the representation, let's say this is a tree, the branch, but the very important part, you don't want to cut that off. Something seemed to go beyond that. Why don't you just extend it into beyond the forms?
Let's keep going.
And create a new form. And she thought about it and said, yeah, you're probably right. but she was incapable of going beyond the forms.
Right.
Okay. The form has restricted her to, in a sense, constrict the content. There's always a relationship between the content and the forms. Okay. Yes, the forms are very important and it should be ruling, but there are occasions in which the content also has to go beyond the forms themselves. And that's how, let's say, thought transcends itself to a deeper, a higher level, or what you would to think of it. So I think the fact that I love both art and philosophy allows me to equivocate that border area a little bit better, because I think philosophy is a little bit too restrictive and like, this must be the way it is, but we know through history the forms do change. Okay, so in that sense it's kind of important. So that's what I want to say, is that the relationship between the interior and the exterior, between the form and the content, they're always mutually informative to a certain degree, even though the forms are the categories that we need to create understanding. So,
and I'm going to second what you're saying by saying that, when Kenneth Smith's not philosophizing, he's painting. He's right there with you, right? Saying, it's not enough to exercise our noesis. We have to exercise our gnosis. We need an experiential part of our life in which we are soaking in the way things actually are, rather than imposing our form all the time. And, art is fantastic for that, right? Whatever your medium is.
Well, I mean, but that's exactly the point. What Plato and the playwrights, right? That was exactly the argument between the art As a matter of fact, I'll point out that, the Greeks were so into art in a sense,
Yeah.
maybe more than philosophy. That's what the Olympic Games are. It's an art form, right? It's war in an artistic expression.
Yes.
And when wars were happening, the real wars were happening, when Olympic Games came up, they stopped it.
Right.
Let's look at the art of war.
Right. Yeah, right there. If you need any evidence that the ancients are not moderns, the fact that they would halt wars in progress so that everybody could go compete in the Olympic Games, and then you only pick up the war after the games are over. I mean, we would never do that. That's not us.
Well, particularly wrestling. That's the art of war in a way, right? It's
Right.
like, let's go look at the synthetic thing.
Right.
Okay, so I'll leave it there. I think the Olympic Games is so important in understanding that structure.
Yes. And on that note, we're going to wrap up for this week, and we'll start up with paragraph 2 of section F next week. Thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did.
Hey, thanks again for putting up with us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Rick.
Bye, Rick.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.